I never imagined that the crushing weight of a past I'd desperately tried to outrun would lead me deep into the mist-shrouded wilds of Monongahela National Forest. But here I am, Marcus Reed, and I'm haunted by memories as palpable as the damp earth beneath my boots. I left the chaos of city life, the endless wail of sirens, and the oppressive concrete maze of my former existence, in search of a quiet solitude I hoped would heal my battered soul. I was once a firefighter, a man forged in fire and tragedy, and though I'd hung up my gear long ago, the scars, both physical and spiritual, remained. In the forest, I thought I might finally find some semblance of peace. Instead, I found something far more sinister. The drive out of the city was an exodus, a slow peeling away of layers of noise and regret. I remember the first time I glimpsed the forest from the highway, the trees rising up in a sea of green mist, ancient and inscrutable, their silhouettes looming like silent sentinels. I felt both excitement and dread. The promise of isolation was irresistible, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was driving headlong into a place where the past and the present intermingled in inexplicable ways. When I finally arrived at the clearing where I planned to build my cabin, twilight had already settled in, and the forest exhaled a cool, damp breath that made my skin prickle with anticipation and anxiety. The cabin I found was nothing like the picture-perfect retreat some might imagine. It was a ramshackle structure of weathered wood and sagging porches, hidden among the towering pines, as if nature itself were determined to reclaim it. With a heavy heart and a mind full of memories I'd rather forget, I set about making it my own. Each creak of the old boards and every groan of the settling walls was a reminder that the past had a way of lingering, even in the most isolated corners of the world. I spent my first days cleaning out the dust, repairing broken windows, and slowly piecing together a semblance of order from chaos. Yet, as I labored by the pale light of early dawn and the gentle glow of dusk, I began to sense that I was not entirely alone. It started with subtle hints, a whisper of a sound, a movement at the edge of my vision that vanished when I turned to look directly. On my second night, as I sat on the creaking porch nursing a cup of bitter coffee, I heard what I first thought was merely the wind threading through the pines. But soon the wind's murmur began to take on a distinctly human quality, a soft, plaintive sigh that seemed laden with sorrow and regret. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks in the isolation, the echoes of my own burdens manifesting as ghostly voices. Yet, in the quiet moments before sleep claimed me, that sound returned with an intensity that left me restless and questioning. The true turning point came a week later, when I discovered enormous footprints pressed deep into the muddy earth just outside my cabin. I'd stepped out early to gather firewood, and as I walked along a narrow, winding trail, my boot struck something soft and yielding. Looking down, I saw a set of footprints, far too large and deliberate to have been made by any creature I knew. A human foot would be smaller, and animal tracks would be far less defined. They were almost ritualistic in their arrangement, as if laid down with purpose. My heart hammered in my chest, and for a long moment I stood there, frozen, staring at the prints. A deep, primal fear clawed its way up my spine. I snapped a few photographs with trembling hands, trying to document the inexplicable evidence, but even as I did so, I couldn't help but feel that I was being marked, observed by something unseen. Desperation and curiosity began to mingle. I dove into the old logbooks I discovered in a dusty corner of a small-town library not far from the forest. The logbooks, filled with handwritten accounts by early settlers and travelers, recounted eerie encounters in these very woods, a series of mysterious happenings involving lost souls and unsettled spirits. One entry, scrawled in spidery handwriting, told of a settler wronged by fate who was doomed to wander the forest for eternity. His spirit, it said, left footprints as a sign of his endless search for redemption. The more I read, the more I felt that my own lonely exile might be entwined with this tragic legacy. I began to see patterns in the uncanny phenomena, the footprints, the whispering voices, even the chill that sometimes descended in the dead of night, as if the very air were mourning a forgotten sorrow. At first, I tried to confront the phenomenon head-on. Armed with a flashlight, a battered recorder, and a notebook, I ventured out on nights when the forest seemed most alive with secrets. I remember one evening vividly. The moon hung low, shrouded in wisps of cloud, and the forest was draped in a silvery mist. I walked the narrow path that led from my cabin to a clearing where the footprints converged. The atmosphere was thick with an otherworldly stillness, punctuated only by the rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. Every step I took felt like a trespass into an ancient domain. Suddenly, from the corner of my eye, I saw it, a flicker of movement among the trees. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there except the silent, unyielding darkness. Yet the feeling of being watched intensified, and I pressed on, determined to gather evidence, to confront whatever restless spirit had chosen me as its unwitting host. I set up my recorder near the base of an old oak tree and sat motionless for what felt like hours, listening to the symphony of nocturnal life. Gradually, a voice, soft, sorrowful, almost like a lament, rose above the natural sounds. It was not a single voice, but rather a layered chorus, overlapping whispers that spoke of grief and regret. I could not understand the words, but the emotion behind them was unmistakable. In that moment, I realized that I was in the presence of something that defied all my rational explanations, a presence steeped in centuries of pain and longing. I scribbled frantic notes in my journal, capturing every nuance of the experience, every shiver that ran through me as the voice ebbed and flowed with the night. Over the following days, the hauntings grew bolder. Shadows would dance at the periphery of my vision even in broad daylight, and on several occasions I awoke to find the door to my cabin slightly ajar, as if someone had been there moments before. The footprints multiplied, now appearing at different locations around my property, each set more deliberate and eerie than the last. I began to feel that I was caught in a cycle, a relentless pull between the desire for isolation and the inexorable force of the past that was determined to make itself known. I reached out to local residents, hoping that someone might share their own experiences or offer some rational explanation. Most dismissed my concerns as the product of an overactive imagination fueled by loneliness and the weight of old tragedies. But a few, older folks with lines of hardship etched deeply into their faces, spoke in hushed tones of a spirit that roamed the forest, a wronged soul, doomed to wander until justice or redemption could be found. I remember one man, his voice trembling with both fear and resignation, saying, "Once you hear his footsteps in the mud, son, you'll know he's never really gone." His words haunted me, and I began to understand that perhaps the ghost I encountered was not a malevolent force, but a remnant of an old sorrow, a manifestation of a past injustice that had never been resolved. I resolved to perform a small ritual, one born not of superstitious desperation but of a deep human need to honor what could not be undone. I gathered a few items, a weathered, hand-carved cross that had belonged to my grandfather, a small tin of incense from a local apothecary, and a faded photograph of a family I'd seen in one of the logbooks, whose eyes seemed to plead for recognition. One cold, moonlit night, I returned to the clearing where the footprints converged. I laid the photograph on a flat stone, lit the incense, and, with a voice that quavered with both determination and grief, I recited a quiet prayer, a plea for the restless soul to find the peace it had long been denied. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The forest fell into a deep silence, the only sound the slow, measured burn of the incense and the soft rustling of the leaves in the gentle night breeze. And then, as if in answer to my plea, the whispering voices swelled into a mournful chorus before fading away into the dark. I felt, more than saw, a presence, a heavy, sorrowful weight that passed over me like a veil. I wasn't sure if it was relief or resignation that settled in my heart, but I sensed that I had made contact with something that transcended the natural order. In the weeks that followed, the hauntings continued, but there was a subtle shift. The footprints remained. The voices still echoed, yet the oppressive dread began to mix with an odd kind of melancholy, a feeling that the ghost was not here to terrorize me but to bear witness to its own unending grief. I found myself talking aloud in the quiet hours, sharing my own sorrows with the unseen visitor, and in those whispered confessions, I felt a strange kinship. I began to see that the forest, with all its ancient trees and misty hollows, was a repository of memories, of lives lived and lost, of regrets unspoken, and of hopes that had withered in the shadows of time. Despite these moments of connection, the truth remained that I was an outsider in this haunted landscape. The relentless pull of unresolved grief, the ceaseless echo of a past injustice, weighed on me, and I slowly realized that my attempt to seek solace in isolation might have been a mistake. The forest had become a living monument to sorrow, a place where every step I took was shadowed by the weight of history, and every whisper carried a reminder of pain that could never be fully erased. In time, the nights grew colder and the mists thicker, and I found that my once cherished solitude was now a prison of memories and ghostly echoes. I tried to maintain a semblance of routine, tending my small garden and repairing the cabin, but my every moment was tinged with the awareness that I was not alone, that the spirit, burdened with its own tragic legacy, was always watching. My dreams turned into long, vivid tapestries of loss and longing. I dreamt of a faceless man walking through the mists, his footsteps leaving behind the same deliberate prints I had documented, and of a spectral voice calling out in the darkness, "Help me, help me." I awoke each time drenched in cold sweat, the words echoing in my mind long after dawn had broken. I reached a point where the burden of the ghost's sorrow and my own unresolved pain became too much to bear. With a heavy heart and a mind laden with the memories of both my past and the restless spirit of the forest, I made the agonizing decision to leave. I packed my few belongings into an old pickup truck, taking with me the journal filled with my frantic notes, the photographs of those eerie footprints, and the small talismans I had collected along the way. As I drove away from the clearing, I looked back one last time at the dark, misty expanse of the forest, where the silhouettes of ancient trees and the whispers of a forgotten past merged into one endless, mournful tapestry. Even now, far from the Monongahela National Forest, I carry with me the echoes of that haunted place, a sorrowful reminder that some ghosts are too heavy to be exorcised, that the past, in all its unresolved grief, can cling to you like the damp mist clinging to the pines. I have learned that in seeking solace from one's demons, one may find new ones lurking in the quiet corners of isolation, waiting to remind you that no matter how far you run, some memories and regrets are inescapable. The footprints I left behind in that muddy clearing remain etched in my mind, a permanent testament to a night when I came face to face with the inescapable truth that some wounds, no matter how time may try to heal them, never fully close. I sometimes wonder if I could have done something different, if acknowledging the ghost's sorrow more fully, or offering a more heartfelt plea might have eased the burden, if I could have helped that wandering soul find peace. But in the end, I realized that some spirits are destined to wander, carrying their own tragic legacies through the endless cycles of nature. I left the forest with a heavy heart, burdened by the knowledge that some ghosts never rest, that their sorrow is woven into the fabric of the land, and that in trying to escape my own past, I had found myself entangled in the echoes of another, Now, whenever I hear the soft murmur of wind through the pines, or catch a fleeting glimpse of a large footprint in the mud after a rainstorm, I am reminded of that time in the forest, a time when I discovered that the line between man and memory, between life and the endless lament of the past, is as thin and fragile as a wisp of mist in the early dawn. I have come to accept that the peace I once sought in isolation might have been an illusion, that sometimes the only way to confront the ghosts of our past is to carry them with us, to learn from them, and to understand that every step we take is marked by the echoes of what came before. In the end, I left the Monongahela National Forest not with the triumph of banishing a haunting spirit, but with a quiet, sorrowful resignation, a recognition that some ghosts, like the pain of loss and regret, will forever linger, etched into our very souls. I drive through the highways and byways of life now, a little wiser and a lot more haunted, carrying the memory of that mist-shrouded forest as a silent reminder that sometimes, in the depths of isolation, we find not solace, but the enduring echo of a past that never truly lets go. I still remember the day I drove away from the relentless hum of the city, leaving behind the concrete corridors and neon nights for something raw and almost mythic. I was Evelyn Monroe, a writer whose soul had long been starved of quiet reflection and authentic inspiration. When I received word of the crumbling farmhouse I'd inherited in Vermont's Green Mountains, it felt as though fate had finally offered me a chance to rewrite my story. The moment I saw that old house perched on a gentle slope, its weathered timbers and sagging porch bathed in the soft autumn light, I felt a stirring deep within me, a call to both refuge and revelation. The farmhouse was everything I had imagined, and something entirely unexpected. Nestled among ancient pines and maples whose fiery autumn leaves danced in the cool breeze, the building wore its age with a certain dignity. The windows, though dusty and cracked, still offered glimpses of what once might have been a warm, bustling home. I spent the first day roaming its rooms, each creak of the floorboards, and every shifting shadow whispering secrets of a past long forgotten. I could almost see the faint outlines of laughter and love embedded in the peeling wallpaper and worn wooden banisters. It was as if the house itself was a repository of memories, a silent chronicle waiting for someone to listen. At first, I felt a deep sense of solace. I set up my small writing nook in a sunlit corner of the parlor, arranging my notebooks, my old typewriter, and a collection of pens that smelled of ink and promise. I planned to craft my long-dormant novel here, drawing from the gentle isolation that the mountains promised. In the early mornings, when the mist still clung to the valleys, I would sit by the window with a cup of herbal tea, watching the light play over the rugged landscape. I filled pages with musings on nature, on solitude, on the quiet power of memories. The very act of writing felt like a healing ritual, a way to breathe life back into the parts of me that had withered in the relentless pace of city life. Yet, almost imperceptibly at first, something began to disturb that fragile peace. Late one night, as I sat huddled over a page in the dim glow of a single lamp, I heard a sound, a soft giggle that seemed to float on the silence. I paused, heart fluttering in confusion. It was a sound so delicate and childlike that I hesitated to believe it was real. The laughter was neither harsh nor mocking. Rather, it carried an undercurrent of wistfulness, as if it were a bittersweet echo from a far-off memory. I listened intently, convinced that it must be a trick of my tired mind. But the giggles persisted, returning with quiet regularity over the following nights. I began to wonder if the house was not as empty as it appeared. One crisp morning, while exploring the far corner of a crumbling hallway, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. A small antique porcelain doll, hidden behind a loose brick in the wall. Its once delicate features were marred by time, The paint faded and chipped, yet its eyes, glassy and unblinking, seemed to follow my every movement. I held it in my hand, feeling a strange mix of sorrow and curiosity. Who had owned this doll? Why had it been left behind in such a secretive manner? The doll's presence sent ripples of unease through me, as if it were a token of a lost era, a remnant of a life filled with joy and then tragedy. I set the doll on a side table in the parlor, where it sat silently amid the scattered pages of my notebooks and the fading photographs of a bygone family. The more I looked at it, the more I felt that it was calling out to me, a symbol of something unresolved, a whisper from the past. That night, as I sat up in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that soft giggles and murmured voices swirled just beyond the edge of my consciousness. Sleep, when it came, was fitful and laden with dreams of flickering candlelight, of small hands reaching out from the darkness, and of a once happy family whose laughter had turned to sorrow. Unable to ignore the persistent tug at my heart, I began to research the history of the farmhouse and the surrounding area. I visited the local historical society in a nearby town, where I spent long hours poring over faded records and brittle newspaper clippings. One story, in particular, caught my attention, a tragic tale of a family who had once lived in the very house I now occupied. According to the records, the family had been struck by unimaginable misfortune. A fire had erupted one cold winter night, claiming the lives of the children while the parents had barely escaped with their own. The details were shrouded in mystery and heartbreak, but one thing was clear. The house had been their sanctuary, and in the wake of the disaster, the echoes of their lost joy seemed to linger like a persistent refrain. Armed with this knowledge, I began to see the subtle manifestations in a new light. The soft giggles in the night, the eerie laughter that drifted through empty corridors, even the silent stare of the porcelain doll, all seemed to be imbued with a melancholy yearning. I wondered if the spirits of those lost children had not been entirely laid to rest, if they lingered still, bound to the home by the weight of their untimely fate. I started to record my observations meticulously in my journal, noting the times when the laughter was at its loudest, the precise locations where the doll's eyes seemed to track my movement, and the fleeting images I caught in the mirror at dusk. A little girl, pale and sad, standing just behind me before vanishing as quickly as she had appeared. The haunting grew more insistent with each passing day, and the lines between my creative reverie and the spectral manifestations began to blur. I found myself writing feverishly at night, my fingers dancing across the typewriter as if guided by an unseen hand, capturing fragments of a narrative that was both mine and not mine, a story of loss, of longing, of the delicate interplay between memory and myth. Yet, even as I wrote, I could not shake the pervasive sense of grief that seemed to infuse every corner of the farmhouse. The very air felt heavy with the echoes of the past, and the distant sound of laughter would sometimes intermingle with the rustle of wind through the pines, creating an almost musical lament that filled the space between heartbeats. Unable to bear the disquiet any longer, I reached out to a local medium whose reputation for gentle, empathetic guidance was well known in the small town. Her name was Lydia, a woman with kind eyes and a voice that carried both wisdom and sorrow. I visited her on a chilly afternoon, and in her modest sitting room, we sat together with tea and a shared sense of quiet understanding. I recounted the strange happenings at the farmhouse, the inexplicable giggles, the doll, the pervasive feeling of being watched, and listened as Lydia nodded knowingly. She explained that sometimes the energy of a tragic past could become so potent that it imprinted itself upon a place, that the unresolved grief of those who had suffered might linger as tender, if painful, echoes. "Your home," she said softly, "is a vessel for memories. The children who once played here, whose laughter once filled these rooms, may still be here, not as a threat, but as a plea for remembrance, a longing to be acknowledged, and ultimately to be at peace. Her words resonated with me in a way that transcended mere logic. Over the next few evenings, with Lydia's gentle guidance, I prepared to perform a small ritual to honor the memory of the lost children. I gathered a few items that seemed to embody the fragile hope of remembrance. A faded scarf that I'd discovered tucked away in an old drawer, a few blossoms of wildflowers freshly picked from the garden outside, and the porcelain doll, which I now regarded as both a relic and a messenger of the past. Under a sky streaked with the deep indigos and silvers of a waning autumn night, I returned to the parlor where the house felt most alive with silent voices. With a trembling voice and a heart full of empathy, I recited a simple prayer, a plea for the souls of those who had been taken too soon, a promise that their memory would live on in every word I wrote and every page of the story I was trying to create. As I finished, the room seemed to exhale a long-held breath. For a moment, all was still. The gentle patter of rain against the window, the soft rustling of the old floorboards, even the persistent murmur of the forest outside, all fell into a reverent hush. And then, as if in response to my invocation, a series of soft, childlike giggles danced through the air. They were no longer eerie or mocking, but tender and almost joyful, a bittersweet harmony that seemed to carry the promise of closure. In that instant, I felt a warmth seep into my bones, a deep sense of compassion and understanding that transcended the boundaries of life and death. It was as though, for one fleeting moment, I had bridged the chasm between the present and the past, offering solace to the lingering spirits of a family lost in tragedy. In the days that followed, the hauntings did not vanish entirely. They simply softened. The mysterious giggles became gentle echoes, a lullaby of memory that played softly in the background rather than a jarring intrusion into my solitude. The porcelain doll remained on its shelf, its glassy eyes now seeming less like an omen of sorrow and more like a silent tribute to a life once cherished. I continued my work on my novel with a renewed sense of purpose. The tragedy of the lost children, their silent plea for remembrance, and the bittersweet beauty of that fleeting moment of connection had become intertwined with my own creative journey. I began to see that the ghosts of the past were not always harbingers of terror. They could also be muses, inspiring a depth of emotion and understanding that no solitary moment in the city could ever evoke. Each morning, as the first light filtered through the canopy of the Green Mountains, I would sit by the window with my journal, writing in a flow that was both cathartic and revelatory. I documented the small wonders of my days, the way the dew clung to the grass like tiny jewels, the gentle song of a distant stream, and the soft, almost imperceptible laughter that seemed to echo in the corners of the old house. I began to weave these observations into my writing, letting the tender echoes of the past infuse my prose with a melancholic beauty that was as real as the mountain air itself. The farmhouse, with all its creaks and sighs, became a living companion rather than an oppressive presence. I found that by embracing its history, acknowledging the grief and loss that had seeped into its very walls, I could transform that sorrow into something creative and profound. My novel, once a nebulous dream of escape, began to take shape as a story of memory and redemption, a narrative where the past and present danced together in a delicate interplay of light and shadow. The ghosts of the lost children, once sources of my deepest anxiety, now emerged as symbols of fragile hope, their soft laughter a reminder that even in tragedy, there can be a whisper of beauty. There were still moments, particularly in the quiet hours before dawn, when I felt a chill in the air or caught a glimpse of a tiny figure reflected in a window, an echo of a face I couldn't quite place. In those moments, I would pause and let myself remember the ritual, the gentle words I had spoken into the darkness, and the quiet, tender response that had followed. I came to understand that the farmhouse was not haunted by malevolence, but by a persistent longing, a desire to be remembered and to find peace. And in that understanding, I found the strength to remain, to continue my work, and to honor the legacy of those who had once filled these rooms with laughter and love. Over time, I learned to accept that the echoes of the past were not burdens to be cast off, but parts of the tapestry that made me who I was. I began to see the tragedy not as a curse, but as a poignant reminder of life's impermanence, a call to live fully, to write honestly, and to let every word be in homage to both joy and sorrow. The farmhouse in Vermont's Green Mountains became my sanctuary and my muse, a place where the whisper of forgotten voices and the gentle laughter of lost children mingled with the rustle of autumn leaves and the sigh of the wind. Now, as I sit in my writing nook by the window, watching the sun slowly rise over the rugged peaks, I feel a quiet gratitude for the strange, bittersweet path that led me here. The city, with its harsh lights and ceaseless noise, seems a world away, a memory of a time when I was too afraid to listen to the soft, enduring echoes of the past. In this old farmhouse, I have found not only a refuge from the chaos of modern life, but also a deeper connection to the timeless rhythm of nature and memory. Each day, as I write and breathe in the crisp mountain air, I honor the voices that linger in these halls, the voices of children who once laughed and loved, whose stories, though filled with tragedy, now inspire me to create, to remember, and to transform grief into art. I do not claim to have vanquished the ghosts that reside in these walls, for they remain an integral part of this place and of me. Instead, I have learned to coexist with them, to let their quiet presence guide my pen and enrich my words. Their laughter, once a source of unease, now rings out as a soft, comforting reminder that even in loss there is beauty, and that every ending carries with it the seed of a new beginning. In the end, the farmhouse is more than just a building. It is a living chronicle of life's tender impermanence, a sanctuary where the past is honored and the future is written in the language of hope. And, as I continue to fill my pages with the stories of those long gone and those yet to come, I carry with me the bittersweet memory of that night when I first heard the laughter in the darkness, a laughter that, in its gentle echo, promised that I was exactly where I needed to be. I remain here still, in this corner of Vermont's Green Mountains, with the ghostly giggles in the empty halls and the soft, unfading presence of a lost family woven into every crevice of the old farmhouse. And every time I feel that familiar tingle of recognition, a small handprint on a dusty window, or the distant, tender sound of a child's laughter, I am reminded that I have become part of a larger story, one where grief and hope are inextricably entwined, and where the past, in all its sorrow and beauty, lives on in the art of remembrance. I never expected that the whisper of wind through towering evergreens could become the soundtrack of my days and nights. My name is Danny Reyes, and I moved to a secluded cabin on the outskirts of Portland, Oregon, seeking solace from a life that had grown unbearably noisy, crowded, and chaotic. The city had worn me down. The constant hum of engines, the ceaseless chatter of busy lives, and the overwhelming glare of artificial light left me craving silence and nature's raw, unfiltered beauty. I thought that in the heart of the Cascades, far removed from the urban sprawl, I might rediscover something pure, something elemental within myself. I could not have been more mistaken about the kind of purity that awaited me. The day I arrived, I was struck by an eerie quiet that belied the vibrant life the forest held. I remember driving down a winding road flanked by towering Douglas firs and cedar trees, the branches interlocking overhead as if protecting the secrets of the forest. The cabin itself was a small, weathered structure tucked among moss-covered boulders and ferns. its windows reflecting the endless twilight of a world untouched by time. I felt like a pioneer, carving out a place for myself where I could start anew. For the first few weeks, life was almost blissfully ordinary. I spent my days chopping wood, tending to a modest garden, and reading old books about survival and local folklore. The isolation, at first, was a balm for my overtaxed mind. I listened to the hum of the creek that ran nearby and the rustle of leaves stirred by the wind. But it wasn't long before I started to notice small irregularities, things that didn't belong in the simple cadence of nature. It began on a foggy evening when the forest seemed to hold its breath. I was sitting on the worn porch, cradling a cup of lukewarm coffee, when I distinctly heard a soft, almost imperceptible murmur that wasn't carried by the breeze. It was as if the trees themselves were speaking in hushed tones, sharing secrets that I couldn't quite comprehend. I dismissed it as the tricks my tired ears were playing on me, a residual echo of the city's clamor that hadn't yet fully relinquished its hold on my mind. But then came the footprints. One morning, after a night of fitful sleep and dreams laden with shapes and shadows, I discovered a series of footprints leading from the edge of the property into the dense undergrowth. They were oddly shaped, too large for any ordinary animal I knew of in these parts, and yet not quite human. The prints seemed to vanish mysteriously, as if swallowed by the earth, leaving no trail for my questioning eyes to follow. I felt an inexplicable shiver run down my spine as I knelt to inspect them. I even took a photograph with my old digital camera, though the images were murky and ambiguous, offering more questions than answers. In the following nights, the murmur returned with a persistence that could no longer be ignored. Sometimes it came as a faint whisper that seemed to call my name. Other times it was a series of disjointed phrases, too fragmented to make sense of. I tried to convince myself that it was simply the wind weaving through the irregular shapes of the forest, creating a symphony of sounds that only my imagination could decipher. But deep down, I sensed that there was something else, a presence that had not yet revealed itself fully. I began researching local legends, scouring library archives, and reaching out to a few old-timers in nearby towns. I learned that the Cascades had long been a place of mystery and myth, where travelers sometimes spoke of ghostly wanderers who roamed the woods at night. These were not malicious entities, they said, but spirits tethered to the land, wandering in search of something lost long ago. I recall an elderly man at a small diner in Portland telling me, over a cup of black coffee, "The forest holds memories, son. Sometimes they whisper, sometimes they scream, and sometimes they remind us that not all who wander are at peace." His words haunted me long after I left the diner, echoing in the recesses of my mind as the whispers outside my window grew bolder. I installed a makeshift surveillance system near the porch, rigging a couple of weathered cameras and a sound recorder, more out of a need to document the inexplicable than out of a desire to confront it. The first night of recording was restless. Every creak and groan of the old cabin was captured, each one amplified by the eerie quiet. I listened to the recordings in my small, cluttered living room, eyes straining in the dim light as I rewound and played back the sounds. There, amid the usual creaks and rustles, I heard a clear, almost pleading whisper that sent chills down my spine. "Come home." It was as if the forest itself was beckoning me toward some forgotten memory or secret buried beneath the mossy earth. That night, sleep was elusive. I lay in bed, heart pounding, every creak of the cabin transforming into a portent of impending dread. I wondered if I had unwittingly intruded upon a realm where the past and the supernatural converged, a place where the dead still spoke in cryptic tongues, and where my own presence might be unraveling threads of history best left undisturbed. One particularly cold night, when the wind howled like a chorus of lost souls and the rain lashed against the window panes, I decided to step outside. I needed to confront the whispers head-on, Clad in a thick jacket and carrying only a flashlight, I walked the perimeter of the property. The forest seemed to come alive in the storm, the trees bending and swaying as if in pain. I paused frequently, straining to hear over the roar of the wind, and it was then that I caught a sound, a clear, human-like sigh that mingled with the storm's fury. I followed the sound to a small clearing where the ground was soft with recent rain. There, in the flickering beam of my flashlight, I noticed an arrangement of stones that I had not seen before. They formed a circle, almost like an altar, and in the center lay an object I could not identify, perhaps a carved piece of wood, or maybe even a remnant of something once revered. The discovery unsettled me deeply. I felt as though I had stumbled upon a ritual site, a place where someone, or something, had once sought communion with forces beyond our world. With trembling hands, I took a few steps back and retreated to the safety of my cabin. The storm raged on, and I spent a long, sleepless night poring over local histories and mythologies, trying to make sense of what I had encountered. I learned about ancient practices, ceremonies meant to honor spirits of the land, and even a few rites designed to appease restless souls. The more I read, the more I began to understand that the presence around my cabin was not malevolent in the conventional sense, but rather a manifestation of the land's deep, timeless memory, a memory that might be as old as the mountains themselves. As days turned into weeks, the whispers continued, evolving into something that felt almost like a dialogue. I began to respond, speaking aloud into the night, my voice tentative and uncertain. I'd say things like, "I hear you," or "What is it that you seek?" The responses were never direct, but sometimes I felt a warmth in the air, as if a presence acknowledged my words. It was an odd kind of communion, one that left me with a mixture of dread and an inexplicable sense of comfort. I experimented with small rituals of my own, drawing upon what I'd learned from local lore. I gathered wild sage and cedar, lighting them as I recited simple prayers meant to honor the spirits of the forest. I set these rituals on nights when the air was still, when the whispers seemed to come closest. The effect was immediate, yet ambiguous. The sounds would pause, replaced by a reverent silence that lasted only a few moments before the murmurs resumed, now tinged with what I could only interpret as gratitude. I was not certain if the rituals were working, or if they merely delayed the inevitable, but I continued, seeking both solace and answers. One evening, during a particularly lucid phase of the full moon, I found myself standing before that circle of stones again. I had prepared a small offering, a handful of wildflowers and a bit of honey, tokens of respect in the old ways. The night was quiet, the storm having given way to a clear, starlit sky. I spoke softly, my words blending with the cool air. "I come in peace. I honor your presence. I wish to understand." For a long moment, nothing happened except the gentle rustling of leaves. Then, almost imperceptibly, the wind shifted, carrying a series of hushed tones that seemed to echo from every direction. I felt the presence intensify, a palpable weight pressing in around me, yet it was not an oppressive darkness. It was more like a vast, ancient sadness, a yearning for connection that transcended the boundaries of life and death. Over the following weeks, I adjusted to this new rhythm of existence. I learned that my life was no longer solely my own, but intertwined with the untold history of the land. I began keeping a journal, recording every unusual occurrence, every voice, every footprint that defied explanation. Some days, I felt I was merely an observer, a chronicler of a story that had been unfolding long before I set foot in the forest. Other days, I felt compelled to become an active participant, a mediator between the living and the remnants of those who had long since passed away. I recall one morning when I awoke to find that the temperature had plummeted overnight, a cold so intense it felt as if the very air had crystallized. I ventured outside, drawn by an irresistible urge to witness the phenomenon. The landscape was draped in a spectral mist, and in the distance I could see shapes that moved with a slow, deliberate grace. They were not figures I could define, a blur of human and animal, of light and shadow. I stood rooted to the spot, heart pounding, as one of the figures approached the edge of the clearing. I dared not call out, fearing that any sound might shatter the fragile equilibrium of the moment. Instead, I simply watched, a silent witness to an encounter that defied rational explanation. When the figure passed and melted back into the fog, I felt an overwhelming sense of both loss and hope, a reminder that perhaps I was not alone in my longing for understanding. In time, the initial terror that had gripped me gave way to a deeper, almost philosophical acceptance of the unknown. I came to see these encounters not as intrusions upon my solitude, but as invitations to explore the depths of history, to unearth the layers of meaning that had been hidden beneath the veneer of everyday life. I spent hours sitting in the quiet darkness of my cabin, listening intently to the cadence of the forest, allowing myself to be enveloped by its ancient song. There were moments when the whispers spoke of joy and sorrow in equal measure, as if conveying memories of lives once lived and lost. And in those moments, I felt an unexpected kinship with the spectral voices, a sense that our destinies were somehow interwoven. I began to share my experiences with a few trusted locals, people who had grown up in the area, and whose eyes held the wisdom of generations. Their reactions varied. Some dismissed my accounts as the overactive imagination of a city dweller unaccustomed to solitude, while others listened with a quiet nod, as if my words confirmed long-held suspicions about the spirit of the land. One man in particular, a retired logger with deep-set eyes and a voice that resonated like distant thunder, told me, sometimes the forest calls to us not to frighten, but to remind us of who we really are. We are but a part of this ancient rhythm. His words, simple yet profound, helped me embrace the unsettling presence as an integral part of my new life. Months passed in a seamless blend of routine and mystery. I learned to read the subtle signals of the wilderness, the way the wind carried a hint of cold, the whisper of branches in the night, the delicate interplay of light and shadow that revealed hidden corners of the forest. The spirit that had initially instilled fear now became a companion of sorts, a silent guardian of a realm that had its own rhythm and meaning. I had begun to see that my off-grid existence was not a retreat from civilization, but rather an immersion into a deeper, more enigmatic reality. I admit that there were days when doubt crept in, when I questioned whether I had merely conjured these experiences in a state of isolation and longing. But then I would encounter a new, unexplainable phenomenon, a footprint here, a clear whisper there, and the evidence would pile up like fallen leaves in the forest. I started to believe that the presence was not a figment of my imagination, but a genuine force, one that demanded respect and understanding. And so I continued my journey, not as a conqueror seeking to vanquish an enemy, but as a humble participant in a dialogue that spanned centuries. One crisp autumn evening, as the leaves turned brilliant shades of orange and red, I sat on my porch watching the sunset paint the sky with hues of gold and lavender. The whisper returned, softer than before, a murmur that seemed to resonate with the fading light. "Stay," it seemed to say, and in that moment I realized that the call was not one of entrapment, but of belonging. The forest, with all its enigmatic voices and ancient rituals, had become part of who I was. It was no longer merely a place to escape the clamor of modern life. It was a sanctuary where the boundaries between the past and present, the living and the spectral, blurred into one continuous thread. That realization brought with it a sense of resolve. I decided that I would no longer live in fear of the unknown, but rather with a mindful acceptance of it. I set up a small altar in a quiet corner of my cabin, a place where I could leave offerings and speak my thoughts aloud to the unseen inhabitants of the land. I embraced my role not as an intruder in their realm, but as a willing guest, one who sought to learn the language of the wind and the stories carried on its breath. In the years that followed, my life took on a rhythm that was as unpredictable as the forest itself. There were nights filled with the soft lilt of ethereal voices and days when the haunting footprints appeared as if to remind me of a past that refused to fade. I grew to love the complexity of this existence, the way each day unfolded with the promise of both beauty and mystery. I began to document my experiences in a series of journals, each entry a testament to the strange, beautiful communion that had reshaped my understanding of solitude and connection. I can now look back on those early days with a mix of awe and humility. The forest had taught me that even in isolation, one is never truly alone. The echoes of lives long past and the memories etched into the very soil of the Cascades had become my companions. The initial terror of the unknown had given way to a profound respect for the delicate balance between human endeavor and the ancient, whispering spirit of nature. I no longer feared the darkness or the mysteries that lurked beyond the familiar. Instead, I welcomed them as integral chapters in my own story, a narrative that was as much about self-discovery as it was about the enigmatic voices that had chosen to reside on my piece of the earth. Today, as I sit by the crackling fire in my modest cabin and listen to the symphony of the night, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, and yes, even the soft, persistent whisper that seems to speak from every shadow, I feel a deep sense of belonging. I have come to understand that the forest is not a place to be tamed or conquered, but a living entity with its own ancient wisdom. Its voices, though at times unsettling, remind me that life is not defined solely by what we can see or measure. It is also composed of the intangible, the memories that linger in the wind, and the echoes that persist long after we have passed through this world. In that quiet communion, I have found a kind of peace, a recognition that my off-grid existence is not a lonely exile but a deliberate, ongoing dialogue with the land. I continue to honor the whispers, the footprints, and the strange signs that remind me that I am part of something vast and timeless. And so, each day, as I walk among the towering trees and listen for the elusive call of the forest, I carry with me the understanding that every whisper, every shadow, is a piece of the puzzle that makes up the beautiful, mysterious tapestry of life in the Cascades. I do not know what the future holds. Perhaps one day I will leave this cabin, the silent witness to my transformation. But for now, I remain here, embracing the unsettling yet enchanting chorus of nature's secrets. I have learned that to live off-grid in this ancient forest is to accept that every breeze, every echo, carries a story that, like mine, is written in the language of the wild and eternal. I still remember the first time I saw the Appalachian ridges stretch out before me, like the gentle sweep of an old lullaby whispered over misty hills. I had left behind a life saturated with the clamor of city streets and the expectations of a career that drained my very soul. My name is Elena Morrison, and I sought refuge in these ancient mountains near Knoxville, Tennessee, not only to rekindle the embers of my long-dormant creativity, but also to find a place where I could truly belong. I had always been a free spirit, enamored with the unknown and the inexplicable, and I believed that the quiet, unyielding beauty of nature would provide a sanctuary for my art and my heart. The cottage I built was modest, a simple structure of weathered wood and stone, tucked away at the edge of a dense forest. It was as if the land had embraced me, its lush canopies and gentle slopes whispering promises of solace and inspiration. I spent my first days reveling in the crisp mountain air, letting the serene silence seep into my bones. I painted for hours on a creaky porch, my brushes capturing the play of light and shadow on the dew-dappled leaves. I wandered the winding trails, marveling at the interplay of sunbeams through towering oaks and maples, and I listened intently to the soft murmur of a hidden creek as it charted its own quiet course through the wilderness. But, as days turned into weeks, I began to notice subtle anomalies that stirred a restlessness within me. In the deep velvet of night, when I thought I could finally surrender to sleep, soft giggles and distant sobs would pierce the stillness. At first, I dismissed these sounds as tricks of my imagination, a residue of loneliness mingled with the creaks of the old house. Yet, on more than one occasion, I awoke to the unmistakable echo of a child's laughter, mingled with a sorrowful wail that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. I remember one particular night when a heavy fog rolled in, draping the world in a ghostly pallor. I had just finished a watercolor of the twilight sky when the sound returned. This time, it was more insistent, like a chorus of tiny voices overlapping in a mournful refrain. I sat in my studio, heart pounding, as the sound swirled around me, carrying with it a chill that defied the warmth of my lantern. The voices were not threatening, yet they were laden with such deep, unspoken sadness that I felt compelled to seek their origin. My curiosity led me to explore the woods at dusk, when the boundary between day and night blurred, and the world took on a liminal, almost otherworldly quality. I found myself drawn to an old, overgrown path that wound its way to a clearing I had never seen before. There, in the dying light, I glimpsed the outline of small figures, fleeting, translucent silhouettes of children playing in a manner that seemed both innocent and hauntingly sorrowful. Their laughter was soft and tentative, as though they were aware of my presence and unsure whether to welcome or flee from it. I could see no faces, only the suggestion of movement, like memories captured in the haze of a dream. Shaken, yet inexplicably moved by the encounter, I returned to my cottage and began to scour the local lore for any mention of such apparitions. I sought out the elders in nearby towns, weathered souls whose eyes seemed to have witnessed a lifetime of secrets. One afternoon, while sitting in a small, dimly lit diner that smelled of fresh-baked bread and old wood, I met an elderly woman named Marjorie. With hands trembling yet determined, she told me of a legend that had been passed down through generations. According to Marjorie, the forest was haunted by the spirits of children who had once roamed these lands, caught in the midst of ancient curses and tragedies that were as old as the mountains themselves. Their laughter, their tears, they were echoes of a past that had not been allowed to fade into silence. Her words resonated deeply within me, stirring feelings that were both terrifying and profoundly poetic. I began to see my cottage not merely as a retreat from a hectic life, but as a stage upon which the drama of past lives was being played out in quiet, spectral scenes. My paintings took on a new urgency as I sought to capture the ephemeral quality of these apparitions, the play of light on dew, the soft contours of a child's laughter echoing in the twilight, the ephemeral beauty of sorrow and joy intertwined. Each night, I found myself compelled to record the sounds and visions that had become part of my everyday life. I set up a small audio recorder near the window of my studio, and on paper I scribbled down every fleeting impression, every soft giggle, every distant sob, every rustle of leaves that might carry a secret message from the other side. I began to dream of these children, their spectral forms etched in my mind's eye, and in those dreams I felt both a connection and a responsibility. It was as if they were reaching out to me, asking me to remember their stories, to give them voice through my art. I also reached out to a local historian named Caleb, a quiet man with a gentle demeanor and a deep, almost mystical knowledge of the Appalachian legends. Over cups of steaming herbal tea in his cluttered study, filled with dusty tomes and faded photographs, He shared with me the tragic tales of families torn apart by ancient feuds and curses, stories of loss and love that had left indelible marks on the land. He spoke of an old curse that had befallen a settlement centuries ago, a curse that trapped the souls of the young in a perpetual state of mourning. The more I listened, the more I felt that I had stumbled into a narrative that was both heartbreaking and beautiful, a story of lives interrupted yet yearning to be remembered. The nights grew longer and the voices more distinct. Sometimes, in the hush of midnight, I would hear a solitary sob echo through the forest, a sound so raw and full of longing that it would pierce the silence like a shard of glass. Other nights, the playful giggles would crescendo into a chorus of overlapping voices, each carrying a hint of mischief and melancholy. I began to experiment with my art as a way to bridge the gap between the living and the departed. I painted in the dark, letting the moonlight guide my brush, and I wrote poetry that captured the ephemeral nature of these encounters. My canvas became a tapestry of shadows and light, where the ghostly forms of children danced in spectral hues of blue and silver. One evening stands out in my memory, a night when the boundary between the tangible and the ethereal seemed to dissolve entirely. I had spent the day working on a large, ambitious painting in my makeshift studio, a work meant to encapsulate the sorrow and beauty of the forest, the fleeting nature of life, and the indomitable spirit of those lost souls. As twilight fell, I stepped outside for a breath of cool mountain air, the canvas still clutched under my arm. The sky was a kaleidoscope of deep indigo and soft lavender, the stars beginning to prick through the darkening veil. I felt an irresistible pull towards the clearing where I had first seen the shadowy figures, a magnetic urge to confront the presence that had so profoundly altered my existence. The clearing lay bathed in the silver glow of the moon, its familiar outline softened by the night's mist. I set down my painting and approached slowly, my heart thudding in a rhythm that seemed to sync with the whispering wind. As I neared the center of the clearing, I saw them again, those elusive figures of children, their forms shimmering with an almost luminescent quality. They moved with an ethereal grace, their laughter now a gentle hum that vibrated in the stillness. I stood frozen, torn between fear and an overwhelming need to reach out. In that moment, the ghostly children looked as if they were beckoning me, inviting me to join them in their silent celebration of life and loss. With trembling hands, I took a step forward and spoke softly. "I am here. I hear you." The words barely left my lips before a hush fell over the clearing. For a long, suspended moment, nothing stirred except the soft rustle of leaves. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw a small, pale hand reaching out as if trying to bridge an unimaginable chasm. The sight sent a jolt through my entire being, a mixture of terror and compassion that I could scarcely describe. I closed my eyes and allowed myself to be carried by an emotion that was both raw and inexplicable, a determination to heal these lingering wounds of the past, to give voice to a silence that had stretched on for too long. Over the following weeks, I became a devoted mediator between two worlds. I spent countless hours in quiet conversation with the unseen, often finding myself speaking aloud in the dim light of my studio, as if addressing old friends I had never met. I would say things like, "Tell me your story," or "What do you need to be free?" The responses were subtle, a shift in the wind, a change in the cadence of the distant laughter. But gradually, I began to discern a kind of narrative unfolding. It was as if the children were sharing fragments of memories, echoes of a time when laughter was abundant, and sorrow had not yet taken root. Their voices carried the weight of forgotten dreams and unsung lullabies, and in those moments, I felt a profound sense of duty to honor their memory through my art. My work transformed during this period. The colors on my palette deepened, infused with the melancholy of twilight and the ephemeral brilliance of moonlit nights. I painted not only what I saw, but also what I felt, the bittersweet interplay of joy and despair, the tender hope that even the most tragic soul could find redemption. I held small exhibitions in the local community, hesitant at first to share what many might dismiss as mere fantasies born of isolation. But those who came to see my work found themselves inexplicably moved, as if the paintings carried an unspoken promise of healing. Some of the older townsfolk, with eyes that had seen too much sorrow, would whisper that my art brought comfort to the restless spirits of the mountains. One particularly crisp autumn evening, as I sat by a small wood stove in my cottage, I found myself poring over an old journal I had inherited from a distant relative. The journal, bound in faded leather and filled with spidery handwriting, recounted tales of the same mountains I now called home, tales of love, loss, and the mysterious happenings that had plagued the early settlers. I was struck by the uncanny parallels between the journal's accounts and my own experiences. The entries spoke of ghostly children, of a family cursed by a long-forgotten feud, and of nights when the air itself seemed to tremble with unsaid words. I read late into the night, the flickering flame of the stove casting dancing shadows on the walls, feeling as though I was piecing together a puzzle that spanned generations. It was as if the past and the present were intertwined in a delicate dance, each step echoing the other in perfect, sorrowful harmony. I began to incorporate these revelations into my work, not merely as a form of artistic expression, but as a ritual of remembrance and reconciliation. I started hosting small gatherings at my cottage, inviting local elders, artists, and anyone who was willing to listen to the murmurs of the forest. We would sit in a circle on cool, starlit nights, sharing stories and memories that had been passed down through the ages. In those moments, the line between the living and the departed blurred, and I felt the weight of history settle softly around us like a comforting quilt. There was an undeniable magic in those gatherings, a sense that by acknowledging the pain of the past, we were paving the way for healing in the present. Despite the growing intimacy with the unseen, there were times when the encounters grew unsettling. On one such night, I awoke to the sound of urgent, frantic footsteps outside my cottage. My heart pounded as I reached for a small lantern and stepped out into the darkness. The air, cool and heavy with the scent of pine and earth. The sound led me to a narrow trail behind the house, where I discovered a series of fresh, disordered prints leading into a thicket. They were far too small to belong to any man, and yet they carried a desperation in their irregular pattern that I could not ignore. I followed the trail cautiously, the lantern's glow barely penetrating the thick underbrush, until I came upon a small clearing where the faint sound of crying emanated from a pile of leaves. There, in the dim light, I saw a figure, a little girl, her form almost translucent, her eyes wide with an overwhelming sadness. I knelt beside her, reaching out with trembling hands, and whispered, "I'm here. I want to help." For what felt like an eternity, I simply held her gaze, her sorrowful eyes telling stories of despair and longing. Then, as silently as she had appeared, she melted into the night, leaving behind nothing but a lingering chill and the soft echo of her lament. That encounter marked a turning point for me. I realized that my role was not just that of an observer or an artist, but of a caretaker for these restless spirits. I began to research ancient rites and local customs aimed at freeing trapped souls. I sought guidance from those who still remembered the old ways, folks who recited prayers passed down through generations and performed rituals under the light of a full moon. I adopted these practices with a respectful heart, blending them with my own intuitive understanding of art and emotion. I created small shrines near the spots where the apparitions most frequently appeared, offering wildflowers, simple carvings, and even handwritten notes of compassion. Slowly, I began to sense a change, a softening of the sorrow, a gentle easing of the despair that had gripped the ghostly figures. It was as if the act of acknowledgement and remembrance was beginning to lift the heavy veil of a long-held curse. In time, the apparitions that had once filled my nights with a chill of dread became less tormented, their laughter growing lighter, their voices mingling with a sense of gratitude. I came to believe that my presence here, in this secluded refuge among the Appalachian ridges, was not a coincidence, but a calling. The spirits, these children with so much sorrow etched into their spectral forms, were reaching out for redemption, and I, with all my imperfections and artistic yearning, had become their unlikely advocate. I began to paint portraits of them, delicate images that captured not only their ghostly appearance but also the deep, aching emotion behind their eyes. Each brushstroke was a prayer, each color a promise of remembrance and healing. As winter approached, the mountains took on an even more mystical quality. The air was crisp, and the mornings were often shrouded in a delicate veil of frost. I spent these cold days indoors, poring over my sketches and writing long, introspective letters to an unseen recipient, as if the spirits themselves were my muses and confidants. During one particularly clear night, as the full moon bathed the landscape in silver, I decided to host one last gathering before the deep winter set in. I invited several of my newfound friends, locals who had come to trust my odd ways and appreciate the blend of art and folklore that defined my life. We sat in a circle in the clearing near my cottage, a fire crackling at the center, and shared stories of loss and hope. In that luminous moment, I felt as though the forest was holding its breath with us, the boundary between the living and the departed almost dissolving in the warmth of our shared humanity. That night, as I walked home under a canopy of stars, I realized that I had found something I had long been searching for, a purpose that transcended the ordinary and touched upon the eternal. The ghosts of these mountains were not malevolent intruders. They were echoes of lives once vibrant, yearning for a voice to tell their tales. I had come here to escape the suffocating confines of a life that no longer felt authentic, and instead, I had become part of a grand, ongoing narrative that wove together art, history, and the intangible threads of the human spirit. Months turned into a season of quiet transformation. I found that each day offered new mysteries to uncover, a fleeting smile reflected in a puddle after a rain, the gentle whisper of wind that seemed to carry words from another time, the subtle interplay of shadows and light that revealed hidden facets of the landscape. I no longer shied away from the nighttime sounds. Rather, I welcomed them as part of a continuous conversation with the past. I spent countless hours on my porch, guitar in hand, strumming melodies that echoed the bittersweet cadence of the forest. Those tunes, sometimes haunting and sometimes hopeful, became the soundtrack of my existence, a way to communicate with the unseen and express emotions that words alone could never capture. Reflecting on those transformative months, I now understand that my journey was not solely about reclaiming a lost artistic spirit. It was also about healing, for both the living and the departed. I became a bridge between two worlds, one where memories lingered like a soft refrain, and one where new life could blossom from the acknowledgement of pain and loss. The ghostly children, once shrouded in sorrow and silence, began to appear more frequently in my dreams as smiling, joyful beings. Their spectral forms, once tormented by the weight of ancient curses, started to glow with an inner light, as if the act of remembrance had granted them a measure of peace. In the years that followed, I transformed my modest cottage into more than just a home. It became a sanctuary, a haven for those lost souls seeking solace, and a refuge for anyone burdened by the unyielding pressures of modern life. I opened my doors to neighbors, travelers, and curious souls, all of whom were drawn to the mystical energy that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the cottage. Together, we nurtured a small community that cherished art, music, and the shared stories of a past that refused to be forgotten. We held annual gatherings beneath the ancient trees, celebrating not only the beauty of the land, but also the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring legacy of those who had come before us. Now, as I sit by the window of my cottage and gaze out at the rolling Appalachian hills bathed in the soft glow of a setting sun, I feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The voices that once haunted my nights have become gentle reminders of a time when life was raw and unfiltered, when every joy and every sorrow was etched indelibly into the tapestry of existence. My art, my music, and the simple act of sharing these experiences have become a testament to the idea that even in the darkest of places, beauty and redemption can flourish. I no longer view the ghostly laughter or the quiet sobbing as mere eerie occurrences. They are the heartbeat of this ancient land, the whispered secrets of generations that have left their mark on these rugged slopes. I have learned to listen, not just with my ears, but with my soul, to the subtle language of the wind, the rustling leaves, and the distant echoes of children whose laughter transcends time. In embracing these voices, I have found not only artistic inspiration, but also a deep, abiding connection to something far greater than myself. Looking back on my journey from the moment I arrived here, I see it as a gradual unveiling of layers, a peeling away of the superficial to reveal the raw, timeless core of existence. I came seeking inspiration, and instead I found a calling. I found that in the quiet moments, when the world seems to hold its breath, there exists a delicate interplay between memory and presence, between sorrow and joy. Each stroke of my brush, each note of my guitar, is imbued with the echoes of those who have walked these hills long before me, and it is my honor to carry their stories forward. There are nights when I still feel the soft, ghostly touch of a child's hand on my shoulder, a gentle reminder that I am never truly alone. In those moments, I close my eyes and offer a silent thank you to the forest, to the ghosts, and to the universe for entrusting me with this sacred responsibility. And so, as the mountain winds sing their ancient lullabies and the stars shine down on this sanctuary of dreams, I remain here, living each day in quiet wonder and humble reverence. In the end, I have come to realize that my life here is not defined by the supernatural events that once unsettled me, but by the profound sense of connection and purpose that they brought. I am both an artist and a storyteller, a keeper of memories, both bitter and sweet. And, in this small off-grid cottage on the Appalachian Ridge, I have found a home where the past and the present meet in a timeless dance. The ghostly children, the gentle sighs of the wind, and the ancient voices of the earth have all become part of the rich tapestry of my life, a tapestry that continues to grow, woven with threads of sorrow, joy, and the enduring beauty of the human spirit. So here I stand, years later, with paint-stained hands and a heart full of whispered secrets, forever grateful for the haunting voices that once stirred my deepest fears, and led me to a profound, transformative love for this rugged, mystical land. My story, like the mountains themselves, is etched in time, layer upon layer of memories, dreams, and the soft, eternal laughter of those who refuse to be forgotten. I never imagined that abandoning the conveniences of modern life would lead me into a confrontation with something that defied every rational explanation I'd clung to all my life. My name is Marcus Lee, and I built my off-grid cabin deep in the heart of the Ozark Woods near Fayetteville, Arkansas, with the intention of reclaiming my independence and proving to myself that I could survive without the constant hum of civilization. I've always been pragmatic, a man who trusts in the tangible and the measurable. Yet, nothing could have prepared me for the experiences that began to unravel the very fabric of my well-ordered existence. I arrived in the Ozarks on a cool autumn morning, the air crisp and filled with the earthy aroma of fallen leaves and pine. The landscape was rugged and unyielding, but to me it promised a kind of freedom I'd never known in the claustrophobic corridors of modern society. I purchased a modest parcel of land, far enough from the nearest town to avoid the distractions of urban life, and set about building a cabin with my own 2 hands. Every log I hewn and every nail I hammered was an affirmation of my resolve to live simply and self-sufficiently. I spent days clearing brush, building a small vegetable garden, and establishing a perimeter with a makeshift fence to mark my territory. It was hard, honest work that grounded me in the reality of physical labor and quiet solitude. For the first few weeks, life was as unremarkable and steady as I had hoped. I rose with the sun, gathered firewood, and fixed small mechanical problems with my generator and water pump. The woods, with their deep silence punctuated by bird calls and the rustle of small animals, soon became my constant companions. I felt I had finally escaped the noise, the deadlines, and the endless pressure of city living. But then the forest began to speak a different language, a language I wasn't prepared to decipher. It started subtly. On a moonless night, while I was making my usual rounds to check the perimeter, I caught a glimpse of something odd near the edge of my property. At first, I assumed it was merely an animal, a deer, perhaps, or a stray coyote, but as I drew closer, I saw tracks that defied natural explanation. They were far larger and more deliberate than those of any creature I'd encountered before. The prints had a shape that was almost humanoid, yet there was something disturbingly distorted about them. The toes seemed elongated, as if they were clawed, and the stride was unnaturally wide. I took a few pictures with my old digital camera, though the images were grainy in the low light, and returned to my cabin with a gnawing sense of unease. The next morning, while inspecting the garden, I found claw marks on a fallen log near the edge of the cleared land. The marks were deep, almost as if made by an animal in a fit of rage, yet there was a deliberate precision to them that made my skin crawl. I rationalized it as the work of some wild predator, but deep down I knew that something was off. Over the following nights, I began to hear strange howls echoing through the woods, low, rhythmic sounds that seemed to follow me on my nightly patrols. The howls were not like any animal call I had ever heard. They were measured, almost mournful, yet filled with an undercurrent of menace that set my nerves on edge. At first, I tried to dismiss these occurrences. I told myself it was the wind playing tricks on my ears, or that my mind was conjuring up shadows in the darkness of isolation. But as the nights grew longer and the howls more insistent, I found myself unable to ignore the mounting evidence that something was stalking my property. I began to notice that the tracks kept reappearing in the same areas, near the thicket at the far end of my land, along the rugged outcrops where the forest gave way to open fields. Each time I followed them, they led me deeper into the darkness, only to vanish without a trace, leaving behind a silence that was as foreboding as it was complete. I remember one particularly cold night, when the wind whipped through the trees like a chorus of unseen voices. I was in the midst of my nightly inspection when I heard a sound that froze me in my tracks, a series of heavy, deliberate footsteps that seemed to mirror my own. I stopped dead in my tracks, heart pounding in my chest, straining to see through the inky blackness. The only illumination came from the thin beam of my flashlight, which danced nervously across gnarled tree trunks and tangled underbrush. There was no mistaking the sound. Someone, or something, was moving with intent around my cabin. I hurried back to the safety of my door, the echo of those footsteps chasing me until I slammed it shut behind me. In the following days, my skepticism, a trait I had always prided myself on, began to crumble. I started to research local lore, seeking any explanation that might lend credibility to these unexplainable encounters. I found scattered references in old county records and obscure texts about a creature known as the Wendigo, a malevolent entity, part spirit and part beast, said to haunt the remote forests of the Ozarks. The more I read, the more I was struck by the consistency of the descriptions. The Wendigo was often depicted as a gaunt, emaciated figure with a predatory hunger and an insatiable desire for human flesh. But what caught my attention was the repeated mention of unnatural tracks, distorted footsteps, and a haunting, inhuman cry. Despite my natural skepticism, the parallels between the lore and what I had witnessed were too uncanny to dismiss entirely. As days turned into restless nights, I resolved to take matters into my own hands. I wasn't one to sit idly by while some ancient evil terrorized my hard-won sanctuary. I began to fortify my homestead in practical ways. A reinforced door here, a better lookout post there. But I also sought guidance from local Native American elders, men and women who carried the wisdom of generations, and who knew the language of the land far better than any book ever could. One chilly afternoon, I found myself sitting on the porch of a small, weathered community center in a nearby town, listening intently to an old man named Elijah. His eyes, deep and knowing, regarded me with a mixture of pity and resolve. In a soft, measured tone, he explained that the creature I was encountering was not merely a wild animal, but a manifestation of a curse, a Wendigo, born of desperation and bound to the darkness that pervaded these ancient woods. Elijah's words chilled me to the bone. He spoke of long-forgotten rituals and protective charms that could ward off such malevolent spirits, of the importance of respecting the natural order and the old ways. I took his advice to heart, determined to blend my own practical methods with the indigenous wisdom that had been passed down through countless generations. Over the next several weeks, I scoured the local area for any remnants of the old ways, small talismans carved from wood, bundles of sage, and even a weathered book of protective rites that had once belonged to a tribal elder. I learned to recognize the subtle signs of the Wendigo's presence, a sudden drop in temperature, an almost imperceptible change in the direction of the wind, and, most disturbingly, the silence that descended after its unholy howls. One evening, as the sky darkened into a deep, bruised purple, I decided to confront the presence head-on. I armed myself not with a weapon, for I was no warrior of old, but with resolve and the tools that Elijah had entrusted me with, a pouch of sage, a small talisman carved in the shape of an ancient symbol, and a crude but effective flare gun. I stepped out into the night, the forest around me alive with unseen eyes, and the rustling of leaves that seemed to whisper secrets. The air was unnervingly still, as I moved cautiously along a narrow path near the edge of my property, guided by the dim light of my headlamp and the steady beat of my heart. As I approached the thicket where the tracks had first appeared, the temperature dropped noticeably. My breath came out in short, visible puffs, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. I could sense that I was no longer alone. The oppressive silence was broken only by the crunch of fallen leaves underfoot and the distant, intermittent snapping of a twig. Then, without warning, I heard it, a low, guttural growl that resonated deep within the woods, followed by a series of heavy footsteps that matched the rhythm of my own. I froze, clutching the talisman tightly in my hand, my mind racing through every survival tactic I'd ever learned. In that moment, the world narrowed down to a single point of focus, the sound, the movement, the palpable sense of malevolence that lurked in the shadows. I moved slowly, deliberately, retreating to a spot where I had set up a small clearing and a makeshift shelter. I spread out the sage and began to chant the protective words Elijah had taught me, my voice trembling but determined. The wind, as if stirred by my incantation, began to whip around me, carrying with it a bitter chill that seemed to seep into my very bones. I saw, in the flickering beam of my headlamp, a shape moving at the edge of the clearing, a silhouette that was both manlike and monstrous, its limbs contorted in unnatural angles, its eyes glinting with a hunger that sent shivers down my spine. For what felt like an eternity, I stood there, rooted to the spot, as the creature circled the perimeter of my makeshift sanctuary. I could not tell if it was toying with me or simply observing. The silence that followed each of its measured steps was a death knell to all rational thought. My pulse pounded in my ears as I recited every protective phrase I could recall, the words forming a barrier of sound and meaning around me. I remember the moment distinctly when the creature paused, as if to regard me directly, its head tilting in a way that suggested both curiosity and malice. In that instant, I felt a cold certainty settle over me. I was facing an ancient force, one that existed beyond the realm of human reason. I mustered all the courage I had and spoke directly into the darkness. I am not afraid of you. I honor this land and all who have come before me. I will not be driven from my home. My voice, though shaky, carried a defiant resolve that seemed to ripple through the air. The creature responded, not with words, but with a sound. A low, mournful wail that vibrated through the trees and set every nerve on fire. In that wail, I heard the echoes of forgotten tragedies, the suffering of countless souls lost to time. It was as if the creature was not merely an embodiment of hunger or malice, but the very spirit of a curse that had festered in these woods for centuries. In the days that followed, I fortified my homestead further. I constructed additional barriers, both physical and symbolic, integrating the indigenous protective rituals with my own practical modifications. I cleared a wider zone around my cabin, removed any potential hiding spots for predators, and even installed motion-sensitive lights along the perimeter. Yet, despite these precautions, the presence of the Wendigo-like entity remained. It was as if the creature was bound to the land itself, an eternal resident of the Ozark wilds, drawn inexorably to the disruption of its ancient domain. I spent long hours poring over old texts and talking to Elijah and other local elders, trying to piece together a coherent understanding of the entity I was up against. I learned that the Wendigo was not simply a monster, but a manifestation of human greed and the desecration of nature, a warning from the ancestors that some things, once disturbed, could never be fully controlled. This notion resonated with me more deeply than I expected. All my life, I had believed that nature was something to be mastered, a resource to be harnessed through will and ingenuity. But here, in these dark woods, I began to see that nature possessed its own ancient powers, ones that were indifferent to human constructs and defiant of human arrogance. One particularly harrowing night, as a new moon shrouded the forest in near-total darkness, I awoke to the sound of frantic rustling outside my cabin. I bolted upright, heart hammering, and grabbed my flashlight and flare gun. I crept to the window and peered out into the ink-black night. For a moment, I could make out a pair of eyes, cold, unblinking, and full of an eerie intelligence, watching me from the tree line. I fired a flare into the darkness, its red light slicing through the gloom and momentarily revealing the hulking form of the creature. It moved with a terrifying grace, its elongated limbs and contorted form a distortion of nature itself. In that flash of light, I felt an overwhelming mix of dread and determination. I knew I had to act, not merely as a defender of my property, but as someone who could not allow this ancient curse to claim another victim. I spent the remainder of that night barricaded inside my cabin, every sound amplified by the pounding of my heart. I prepared for what I sensed would be a final confrontation, a struggle not just for my life, but for the sanctity of the land I had come to revere. In the following weeks, I immersed myself in the rituals and protective practices that I had learned from the elders. I fashioned talismans from local wood, burned bundles of sage and sweet grass at the edges of my property, and even created small totems that I placed near the entrance to my cabin. Every action was a small act of defiance against the darkness that lurked beyond. I found that each night, as I lay awake listening to the forest's restless breath, I was slowly forging a bond with the ancient spirit of these woods. It was not a bond of friendship, nothing of that sort, but a grudging respect between two forces determined to coexist despite the inevitable clash of wills. I came to understand that my struggle was not one of domination, but of balance, a delicate negotiation between human will and the timeless, relentless energy of nature. In moments of rare quiet, when the creature's presence was but a distant murmur, I allowed myself to reflect on the irony that had brought me here. I had come to escape the chaos of modern life, seeking solitude and self-reliance, only to confront a force that seemed as old as the forest itself. The experience forced me to reckon with my own limitations, to accept that there were mysteries beyond the reach of logic and reason. There were nights when I would sit outside on my battered porch, the chill of the Ozark air mingling with the remnants of my own fear, and watch the dark silhouettes of the trees sway in the wind. In those moments, I felt a profound loneliness, a loneliness not born of isolation, but of an understanding that I was merely a transient interloper in a realm that had existed long before me and would persist long after. Yet, amid that loneliness, there was also a strange comfort. The forest, in all its enigmatic terror, had become my teacher. It had stripped away my reliance on technology and modernity, leaving me bare before forces I could neither tame nor fully comprehend. Time passed, and gradually the relentless cycle of dread and confrontation gave way to a cautious coexistence. I never rid myself of the constant awareness that something was out there in the dark, watching, waiting, but I also learned to live with it, to accept that the presence was as much a part of this land as the ancient oaks and winding streams. I integrated the protective rituals into my daily routine, speaking quiet prayers as I chopped wood or tended to my garden, and, in doing so, I felt that I was establishing a fragile truce with the spirit that haunted my nights. I still recall one evening vividly, a night that seemed to mark the turning point in my uneasy truce. The sky was overcast, the moon hidden behind a veil of clouds, and the forest was draped in an oppressive, almost tangible silence. I was checking one of the newly installed motion sensors when I heard a sound that made me stop in my tracks, a soft, almost sorrowful moan, rising from the depths of the woods. I felt a chill pass over me as I listened. It was as if the very soul of the forest were crying out in anguish. My hand trembled on the sensor, and for a moment, I wondered if the old legends were more than mere stories. I responded as I had learned to do, reciting the protective phrases under my breath and lighting a flare to cast a harsh red glow into the darkness. The moan faded into silence, and I took that as a sign that my rituals were working, however tenuously. In the months that followed, I maintained a vigil of sorts. Each night, I would sit outside, armed with nothing more than my headlamp and the talismans I had fashioned, listening to the subtle symphony of the woods, the whisper of the wind, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, and sometimes the distant, rhythmic echo of heavy footsteps. I learned to decipher these sounds, to understand the language of the forest as it shifted between moments of benign tranquility and pulses of ancient, brooding intensity. There were nights when the creature would come close enough that I could feel its presence like a weight on my soul, and in those moments I reminded myself that I was not alone in my struggle. I was part of something larger, a continuum of survival, of respect for forces beyond our control. I do not claim that I ever fully understood the nature of the Wendigo-like entity that stalked the outskirts of my property. It remained an enigma, a specter at the edge of my rational world. But what I did come to realize was that my life in these woods had become a delicate dance between fear and acceptance, between resistance and reverence. I was no longer just a pragmatic survivalist seeking independence. I was a guardian of a fragile peace, a man who had learned that sometimes the only way to live is to acknowledge that there are mysteries in the world that cannot be neatly solved by logic alone. Looking back now, with several long, grueling seasons behind me, I understand that my journey into these dark, ancient woods changed me irrevocably. The creature that had once terrorized my nights became less an enemy, and more a constant reminder of the wilderness's timeless power. I fortified my homestead, yes, but I also fortified my spirit, learning that survival sometimes means yielding to the natural order, rather than forcing your own will upon it. I learned to live in harmony with the darkness, to recognize that it was as much a part of life as the light that followed the dawn. Today, as I sit on my weathered porch watching the last light fade behind the jagged silhouette of the Ozark ridges, I feel a steady calm. I still hear the distant, measured footsteps and the occasional mournful cry echoing through the pines, but now they blend into the nightly chorus, a reminder of the ancient force that lives here. I have become a part of this land in ways I never anticipated, a reluctant partner in an age-old dance between humanity and the wild unknown. My life is not without its moments of fear, and I often wake in the night with the echo of that primordial howl ringing in my ears, but I have come to accept that such is the price of true freedom. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world is draped in soft shadows, and the air still carries the scent of pine and earth, I sometimes think back to the man I used to be, the man who believed that nature could be conquered through sheer determination and modern ingenuity. I now know that nature is not a force to be conquered. It is a realm to be respected, a living tapestry of beauty, horror, and ancient wisdom. The creature I once thought was a threat has become a symbol of that truth, a reminder that some forces in this world are not meant to be controlled, but merely understood and, if possible, honored. As I continue to live off-grid in these ancient woods, I've integrated the protective wisdom I gained from those who came before me into every aspect of my daily routine. I speak a quiet prayer as I pass by the totems I've erected, and I take time to listen, to truly listen, to the voices of the forest. And in doing so, I've found a peace that eluded me in the confines of modern life. I know that every night, as the wind picks up and the darkness deepens, I am not alone. I share these woods with an entity that is as old as time itself, and, while its presence will forever be a reminder of the unknown, it has also become a part of the home I've built here. I won't say that I've tamed the wilderness, or that the terror has completely abated, far from it, but I have learned to live with it, to embrace the mystery rather than fear it. And in that embrace I've discovered a resilience I never knew I possessed. The Ozarks, with all their raw, untamed power, continue to challenge me every day, and I face each challenge with a steady heart and a mind that is open to the lessons of the old world. In the end, my story is not one of triumph over darkness, but of coexistence with it. I stand guard at my humble homestead, ever watchful, ever respectful of the forces that dwell in the shadows. The Wendigo-like presence remains, a spectral reminder of the ancient curses and forgotten truths of this wild place, but it is no longer a terror to be vanquished. Instead, it is a part of the natural order, a force that, while fearsome, has taught me the true meaning of humility and the necessity of balance. So, as I sit here, under a sky slowly lightening with the promise of a new day, I know that I have become more than just a survivalist. I have become a custodian of a fragile peace, a bridge between the rational world I once trusted and the mysterious, timeless wilderness that now defines my every waking moment. And in that duality, between fear and acceptance, between solitude and communion, I have found a life that, though marked by challenges and unexplainable phenomena, is undeniably and irrevocably my own. I arrived in the Smokies on a damp autumn afternoon, with nothing more than a battered suitcase, a few well-worn notebooks, and an unyielding desire to escape the relentless clamor of city life. I'd been chasing inspiration and solitude for years, and Gatlinburg, Tennessee, with its mist-wreathed ridges and ancient forests, promised a sanctuary for my restless soul. My name is Allison Burke, and I've always believed that nature holds secrets that can heal even the deepest wounds. I had left behind a life of endless deadlines and neon lights, yearning instead for the slow, rhythmic pulse of the mountains, a pulse that, I hoped, would guide me to a new beginning. The little cabin I'd chosen to call home sat on the outskirts of a clearing deep within the forest. It was a modest structure, built from rough-hewn logs that smelled of cedar and earth, its windows reflecting the endless blue of the sky and the timeless dance of shadows from towering pines. The cabin had a charm all its own, a crooked porch, a stone chimney that exhaled lazy plumes of smoke, and an interior where every creak of the floorboards whispered tales of bygone days. I spent my first few days unpacking, arranging my few belongings, and simply listening to the murmur of the wind, the rustling of leaves, and the far-off call of a whip-poor-will that seemed to beckon me to linger in this timeless space. In those early days, life felt almost blissfully ordinary. I immersed myself in writing and painting, my hands and heart guided by the subtle rhythm of nature. But as the nights lengthened and the shadows grew deeper, I began to notice the peculiarities that tugged at the edges of my contentment. At first, it was a slight misalignment in the wind, a rustle that wasn't quite right, a whisper too soft to be the sound of leaves. Then came the footprints, small, deliberate marks near the door of my cabin, as if someone or something had carefully paced around the building. I dismissed them initially as the wanderings of a curious animal, but the impressions were too neat, too deliberate, as if etched by hands with intent. It wasn't long before unsettling dreams invaded my sleep. I would awake in the pitch-black hours of night, heart pounding, and sheets tangled around my limbs, only to see, for a fleeting second, the figure of a hooded woman standing at the edge of my vision. The woman was draped in garments that seemed to blend into the darkness, her features obscured by the heavy fabric of her hood. In my dreams, she moved silently, almost imperceptibly, as if gliding between the realms of memory and myth. At dawn, I would awaken with her image burning in my mind, a silent messenger whose presence I could neither explain nor ignore. I tried to dismiss these episodes as mere illusions conjured by isolation and the stress of starting over. After all, I had come here to find solace, not to be haunted by phantoms. Yet, as the days wore on, the signs multiplied. One misty evening, while I was tending a small garden patch behind the cabin, I noticed strange symbols carved into a large, flat stone near the edge of the property. The markings were intricate and archaic, reminiscent of ancient sigils I'd seen only in old folklore books. Their curves and lines, worn smooth by time and weather, seemed to pulse in the twilight as if imbued with a life of their own. I stood there, tools in hand, staring at the stone with a mix of trepidation and curiosity, wondering if I had unwittingly stumbled upon a remnant of rituals long forgotten. Determined to understand these anomalies, I began frequenting the nearby town. There, I encountered a motley group of locals, people who spoke with quiet certainty about the legends of the mountains. I met a kindly librarian named Marlene, who, after hearing my story, handed me a dusty, leather-bound volume of regional folklore. The book recounted tales of witches and spirits who roamed these very woods, of rituals performed under the light of a full moon to appease restless souls, and of an enigmatic figure known simply as the Mistress of Shadows. According to local lore, this woman was believed to be a guardian spirit of the mountains, a solitary figure who roamed the Smokies, her presence a harbinger of both blessing and warning. The idea fascinated and terrified me in equal measure, for in my dreams I saw a similar figure, cloaked in darkness and mystery. Back at my cabin, Each night took on a different hue. The once comforting soundscape of chirping crickets and rustling trees was now punctuated by inexplicable echoes, soft, almost musical hums that seemed to rise from the earth itself. I began to sense that the forest was speaking a language older than words, a language that my urban upbringing had never allowed me to understand. There were nights when the moon hung low and full, casting elongated shadows that danced in ways that defied logic, and it was on such nights that the hooded figure would appear, lingering at the periphery of my vision. I'd catch glimpses of her from behind the tall pines, her silhouette merging with the darkness, as though she were both part of the forest and apart from it. One particular night remains seared into my memory. I had stayed up late, feverishly scribbling in my journal, attempting to capture the elusive essence of the dreams that plagued me. The air outside was unnervingly still, and the only sound was the soft drip of rain from the eaves of the cabin. As I scribbled the final lines of a poem that I felt was a fragment of some lost incantation, I heard the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on the gravel path leading to my door. My heart skipped a beat, and I paused, pen hovering in midair. The sound was deliberate, measured, a slow, steady approach that could not have been the work of a stray animal. I crept to the window and peered out into the dark, rain-washed night, only to see a faint glimmer of a figure standing under the glow of a distant street lamp. For a long moment, I stared in disbelief. There, half obscured by the curtain of rain, was the figure of a woman, her features hidden beneath the shadow of a deep hood. She did not move, merely observed, as if waiting for me to acknowledge her presence. Shaken, I hesitated before opening the door. The moment I did, the figure vanished into the inky darkness, leaving me with an overwhelming sense of loss and longing. I stood there, drenched by the persistent drizzle, trying to convince myself that it had all been a trick of the light, a figment of an overactive imagination. But as the night wore on, I could not shake the feeling that I had been marked by some ancient promise or warning. In the weeks that followed, I resolved to confront the mystery head-on. I began by revisiting the clearing where I'd found the carved stone. Armed with a flashlight and my newfound collection of folklore, I walked the narrow trail through dense underbrush until I reached the spot. Under the faint glow of my beam, I traced the symbols with my fingers, feeling an odd warmth emanating from the cold stone. I murmured the words I had learned from the book, ancient invocations meant to honor the spirits of the land. The act felt both absurd and sacred, a desperate bid to bridge the gap between my modern skepticism and the primal traditions of the mountains. For a few heartbeats, the forest around me seemed to hold its breath, and I felt a subtle shift in the air, a kind of silent acknowledgement that I had spoken the language it understood. Encouraged by that fleeting connection, I began to weave these rituals into the fabric of my daily life. Each morning, as I brewed a cup of herbal tea over my creaking wood stove, I'd whisper a small prayer of thanks to the unseen forces that governed the land. In the evenings, as the sky blushed with the colors of dusk, I would light a circle of candles on the porch and allow the gentle flame to flicker against the encroaching dark. These moments of quiet communion gradually transformed my fear into a cautious respect. I came to see the hooded figure not as a harbinger of doom, but as a guardian, a silent sentinel who watched over the mountains, burdened with the sorrow of countless lost souls. Yet, not every encounter was so measured and gentle. There were nights when the presence grew more insistent. I recall one bitterly cold night when a fierce wind whipped through the trees, scattering leaves in frenzied spirals. I was nestled in a thick blanket on the worn armchair by the window, trying to capture my turbulent thoughts in a journal entry, when I heard it, a low, mournful moan that seemed to echo from the very depths of the forest. The sound was both heart-wrenching and terrifying, as if the mountain itself were crying out in anguish. My pen stuttered to a halt, and I sat transfixed, unable to tear my eyes from the rain-streaked glass. In that moment, I felt the unmistakable weight of centuries pressing upon me, as if the sorrow of the ages had chosen this night to reveal itself in a raw, unfiltered cry. The next morning, I awoke to find fresh symbols etched into the bark of an ancient oak near my cabin. They were similar to those on the stone, a series of spirals and looping lines that seemed to pulse with a secret rhythm. My fingers trembled as I ran them over the grooves, feeling as though I were touching a piece of someone's forgotten soul. I began to wonder if these marks were a form of communication, messages left behind by a presence that wished to be understood. Was the hooded figure trying to warn me, to beckon me to remember something long buried? The question haunted me as I set about my day, each step in the forest a tentative journey into realms of mystery and memory. Driven by a growing need for clarity, I sought out local historians and elders who could shed light on the legends of the Smokies. I met a retired schoolteacher named Geraldine at a small-town library, her eyes sparkling with the secret knowledge of someone who had spent a lifetime among these hills. Over cups of strong, bitter coffee, she recounted tales of a witch long ago wronged by the settlers, a woman who, in her anguish, had vowed to protect the land from exploitation. Geraldine's voice softened as she described how the spirit of this witch had become entwined with the forest, manifesting sometimes as a gentle guide and other times as a forewarning of nature's wrath. "The mountains have memory, dear," she said in a hushed tone, as if the words themselves were sacred. "They remember every tear, every betrayal, and sometimes they call out to those who are willing to listen." Geraldine's words resonated deeply within me, and I found myself drawn ever closer to the mystery of the hooded figure. I began to incorporate her insights into my daily rituals. I would leave small offerings at the base of ancient trees, handcrafted trinkets, wildflowers gathered at dawn, and even scribbled notes of gratitude. In return, I sensed that the forest, in its vast and indifferent way, acknowledged my gestures. The soft hum of the wind through the pines, the murmur of a distant stream, and the gentle rustling of leaves became a silent conversation between myself and the wild. As autumn deepened into winter, the landscape transformed into a study in contrasts, brilliant bursts of orange and red, giving way to the stark beauty of frost-covered boughs and crystalline streams. The change in seasons brought with it a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The nights grew longer and colder, and the mysterious apparitions became more pronounced. It was on one such night, when the stars were obscured by a thick veil of clouds, that I found myself once again confronted by the hooded figure. I was sitting on the porch, wrapped in a heavy quilt, when I noticed a distinct silhouette emerging from the shadows of the tree line. This time, however, the figure did not vanish into the darkness as soon as I acknowledged it. Instead, she lingered, her presence marked by a quiet, almost imperceptible glow that seemed to radiate from within. I watched, transfixed, as she slowly approached the edge of the clearing, each step deliberate and laden with purpose. In that silent encounter, time appeared to slow to a crawl. My breath caught in my throat as I mustered the courage to speak. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible above the whispering wind. For several agonizing moments there was no reply, only the soft cadence of nature, the steady beat of my heart echoing in the stillness. And then, as if in response to my plea, the figure raised a hand, and I saw, for a fleeting second, an expression of sorrow etched into the faintest lines of her face. It was a look that spoke of centuries of loneliness, of a burden carried silently through the ages. In that silent communion, I felt an overwhelming surge of empathy, a kinship forged not through words, but through shared vulnerability in the face of an ancient, unknowable world. That encounter marked a turning point for me. I realized that my off-grid existence in these mountains was not merely an escape from modern chaos, but an invitation to participate in a dialogue as old as the land itself. I began to see my cabin not as a fortress against the supernatural, but as a meeting place between the past and the present. I expanded my rituals, blending the practical with the mystical, using both modern tools and the wisdom of ancient lore to maintain a delicate balance. I fashioned a small altar in a corner of my living room, placing there a collection of offerings, a handful of wildflowers, a smooth stone etched with the mysterious symbols, and a faded photograph of the mountains that I had taken on my very first day here. Every evening, before the darkness swallowed the world outside, I would sit by this altar and speak softly to the unseen forces, acknowledging their presence and offering my thanks for the insights they bestowed. In the ensuing months, the encounters with the hooded figure became less frequent, and her presence took on a different quality. No longer did she appear as a spectral warning or a harbinger of impending doom. Instead, she seemed to have become a quiet companion, a silent guardian watching over the land and its mysteries. I still felt the occasional brush of a presence in the periphery of my vision, a soft whisper of a name that I couldn't quite recall, but these moments were now interlaced with a profound sense of connection rather than fear. I began to understand that the boundaries between the living and the spectral were not as rigid as I had once believed. The mountains, with their timeless beauty and hidden sorrows, had a way of blurring the lines between what was real and what was felt. One crisp winter evening, as I sat by the fire with a mug of spiced tea warming my hands, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. The ghosts of the past, the whispered secrets of the forest, and the enigmatic figure in the hood had all left their mark on me. I realized that I had come seeking solitude and inspiration, only to find that the mountains had offered me something far richer, a tapestry of stories and emotions that transcended the boundaries of time. I had learned that the land carried the memories of countless souls, each one a thread in the intricate fabric of nature's eternal narrative. And in listening to those memories, I had discovered a part of myself that I had long thought lost, a deep, abiding connection to the rhythms of the earth and the silent language of the wild. I have no illusions that the mysteries of the Smokies have been fully unraveled. There remain questions without answers, shadows without names, and voices that echo in the darkness with no known origin. Yet I have come to accept that some enigmas are meant to be lived rather than solved, to be experienced as part of the rich, chaotic beauty of life in these ancient mountains. My days are now filled with quiet wonder, a careful balance between creative expression and reverence for the forces that dwell in the wild. I continue to write in my notebooks and paint the subtle interplay of light and dark, each stroke and each word a small tribute to the spirit of the land. In the end, I've learned that living off-grid in the Great Smoky Mountains is as much about embracing the unknown as it is about carving out a space for oneself in a world that often feels too fast and too shallow. The hooded figure, the strange symbols, the soft murmurs of the forest, they have all become parts of my personal myth, woven into the story of my life in these hills. I remain ever vigilant, ever respectful of the delicate balance between nature and the unseen, knowing that the mysteries of the Smokies will continue to reveal themselves in quiet moments when one listens with an open heart. And so, as the seasons turn and the cycles of the earth persist, I continue my journey, a solitary wanderer in a realm of ancient secrets and silent echoes, forever changed by the gentle, unyielding power of the mountains. I live here, not as an outsider, but as a part of something larger than myself, a small voice in the eternal conversation between the living and the spectral. My days are filled with both light and shadow, joy and sorrow, creativity and quiet contemplation. And every evening, as I light a candle by my altar and offer a silent prayer to the unseen guardians of the Smokies, I feel that the land listens in return, whispering its timeless lullaby into the dark. In this profound communion with the wild, I have found a home, a sanctuary not built of bricks or stone, but of memories, dreams, and the unspoken promise of a land that remembers. I remain here, steadfast and unafraid, knowing that every rustle of leaves, every flicker of light, every soft footstep in the dark is a reminder of the delicate, enduring dance between man and nature. And it is in that dance that I have found not only inspiration, but the true meaning of life itself. I still remember the first time I set foot on the property, a narrow, winding road that led me deep into the northern reaches of Michigan, where the trees grew tall and silent, and Echo Lake lay cradled by a dense, ancient forest. My name is Brian O'Connor, and after decades spent buried in the controlled chaos of engineering projects and city life, I longed for a quiet corner of the world where I could reclaim the stillness that had so long eluded me. I had built my off-grid cabin by the lake with careful, deliberate planning, every detail calculated to provide a refuge from the relentless hum of modern existence. I thought I'd come to find peace, a place where the only rhythms were the gentle lapping of water against a worn wooden dock and the whisper of wind through birch and pine. I did not anticipate, however, that the serenity I craved would come with its own set of inexplicable anomalies. The first few weeks passed in a measured calm. I spent my mornings checking on my solar panels and water pump, methodically inspecting every piece of equipment as I had always done in my previous career. Afternoons were dedicated to simple tasks, chopping firewood, tending a small garden, or simply sitting by the lake with a thermos of black coffee, letting my thoughts wander among the reflections on the water. I kept a detailed journal, not only for my own peace of mind, but also out of a lingering impulse to record every observation with the precision of an engineer. Yet, it wasn't long before I began to notice small discrepancies in the otherwise ordered environment. One chilly October evening, as twilight draped the lake in deep blues and silvery grays, I noticed a strange phenomenon. I was sitting on my back porch, a notebook open on my lap, when I observed a series of flickering lights dancing on the surface of the water. At first, I assumed it was merely a trick of the light, perhaps reflections from the stars or distant campfires, but the lights moved in deliberate patterns, as if orchestrated by an unseen hand. I stepped down to the edge of the dock, careful not to disturb the water's surface, and watched as the lights shifted from a soft blue to a gentle amber hue. There was something almost playful about them, and yet they set my nerves on edge in a way I couldn't quite articulate. A few nights later, during a dense fog that swallowed the landscape in a ghostly shroud, I was jolted awake by a series of disembodied voices. At first, I thought they were fragments of my own dreams, faint, half-remembered echoes of a life I had left behind. But as I lay in bed, the voices grew more distinct, and I could almost make out the sound of children laughing. It was a light, musical laughter that carried no malice, but it was unnerving nonetheless, resonating through the silence of the night like an old, forgotten melody. I sat up, heart pounding, and strained to catch every syllable, yet the voices were transient, dissolving into the mist as soon as I tried to focus on them. My rational mind insisted that there had to be a logical explanation, a reflection on a broken window, perhaps, or the sound of wind whistling through a loose shutter. I even went so far as to check the integrity of every fixture in my modest home, running diagnostic tests on the electrical system and inspecting the frame for any signs of wear or decay. Everything was as it should be. Still, my journal filled with observations, meticulous notes of temperature drops, wind speed variations, and the precise moments when the laughter echoed through the dark. I began to wonder if my mind was playing tricks on me in the solitude of my new existence. Then, one damp morning, as a low mist clung to the water, I encountered something that defied all my attempts at rational explanation. I had risen early, as was my custom, to capture the quiet beauty of dawn over Echo Lake. I set out along the shoreline with my camera, determined to document the ephemeral interplay of fog, water, and light. As I rounded a bend near a copse of birch trees, I saw them, a group of faint, spectral silhouettes of children. They played in the shallow shallows, their forms so indistinct that for a moment I wondered if they were nothing more than reflections on the water. Yet there was movement, deliberate and joyful, as if they were engaged in some timeless game that transcended the limits of physical existence. I stood rooted to the spot, heart in my throat, as the children's laughter filled the morning air, a sound that was both joyful and achingly sad. I snapped several photographs, though the images came out blurry and indistinct, as if the camera itself was struggling to capture what lay before it. I later examined the photos on my computer, and although I could not make out clear faces, the ghostly figures were unmistakable in their form. They seemed to shimmer in and out of focus, as if caught between dimensions. The experience left me deeply unsettled, and that day I added a new entry to my journal, one that read more like a confession of disbelief than the methodical records I was accustomed to keeping. The days that followed grew increasingly perplexing. Objects around my cabin, which I had left in a state of careful order, began to shift inexplicably. A small, carved wooden box that I had placed on the mantelpiece one afternoon was found later in the same day on the porch, its contents undisturbed, but its position altered as if it had been moved by an unseen hand. I considered the possibility that an animal might have tampered with my belongings, but no evidence of tracks or disturbance in the surrounding underbrush could account for such an occurrence. I even set up a rudimentary camera system to monitor the area around my home, only to find that the footage captured only static and the occasional flicker of movement in the peripheral vision, nothing that definitively explained the shifting objects. Determined to reconcile these phenomena with logic, I turned to local sources of information. I visited a nearby town, a small cluster of communities, where the pace of life was slow and old stories were still told with a reverence that modern science could scarcely comprehend. In a cramped, dimly lit diner, I met an elderly gentleman named Frank, whose eyes had seen decades of seasonal change and whose voice trembled with the weight of old legends. Over a cup of lukewarm coffee, Frank recounted a tale of lost children who had once roamed the shores of Echo Lake, a tragedy from many years ago when a sudden storm had swept away a group of youngsters during a family outing. According to local lore, their spirits had never found rest, bound eternally to the place where they had vanished. I listened, at first, with a measure of skepticism that had been my shield for so long, but gradually I found myself drawn into the narrative, the details resonating with the unexplained phenomena I had been experiencing. Frank's story was not the kind of tale meant to incite fear. Rather, it was told with a kind of melancholy acceptance, as though the loss had left an indelible mark on the very soul of the community. He mentioned that on foggy nights one might hear soft giggles, or see the faint outlines of children darting along the water's edge. "They're not here to harm you," he said gently, "but they're reminders of a past that refuses to fade." His words, delivered in a slow, deliberate cadence, unsettled me not so much as a warning, but as an invitation to acknowledge that there were things in this world that defied explanation. Back at my cabin, I wrestled with the dichotomy between my analytical mind and the mounting evidence of the inexplicable. I began to experiment with documentation, setting up audio recorders by the lake, installing additional cameras in strategic positions around the property, and even using a portable weather station to monitor the microclimate during the hours when the phenomena were most active. Every night, I reviewed the recordings, noting the precise moments when disembodied laughter emerged from the fog, and when the lights on the water shifted in hue. I attempted to correlate these occurrences with changes in temperature, humidity, and wind speed. hoping that some pattern would emerge that I could attribute to natural causes. And yet, despite the meticulous data, a cold uncertainty crept into every analysis. One particularly foggy night, as I sat at my makeshift desk in the cabin with the glow of my computer screen as my only companion, I heard a clear, almost melodic voice calling my name from the direction of the lake. It was soft and resonant, carrying a blend of warmth and sorrow that left me momentarily breathless. I paused the recording and listened in silence. The voice repeated my name, Brian, with a cadence that was almost like a lullaby. In that moment, the rational part of my mind waged war with something more primal, something that knew instinctively that the world was not entirely governed by the laws of physics and reason. I decided to seek the counsel of a local medium, a woman named Mary Ann, who was known in the area for her sensitivity to the unseen and her ability to bridge the gap between the material and the spiritual. Mary Ann lived in a modest cottage on the outskirts of the small town, a place filled with the aroma of dried herbs and the soft murmur of wind chimes. When I explained my experiences to her, she listened intently, her eyes soft yet piercing, as though she could see beyond the veil of what I considered reality. "The lake is a repository of memories," she said quietly, almost as if reciting a mantra. "The children you see are echoes of a time when life was tragically brief. They linger because their stories remain unfinished." She suggested that a cleansing ritual might help ease the tension in the area, allowing the lost souls to finally find a measure of peace. Mary Ann's voice, both comforting and enigmatic, filled the space between skepticism and belief. I left her cottage with a small bag of herbs, a talisman she had inscribed with protective symbols, and a cautious hope that perhaps I could find some resolution. That very evening, under a sky cloaked in a velvety shroud of clouds, I decided to perform the ritual. I gathered on the shore of Echo Lake, a spot where the water lapped gently against a rocky outcrop, and arranged the items in a neat circle. I recited the words Mary Ann had taught me, a blend of archaic phrases and my own tentative improvisations. The air was still, and for a moment it felt as though time itself were pausing to listen. I felt an odd warmth emanate from the circle, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I cannot say whether the ritual worked in the way one might hope for a dramatic resolution, but over the next few nights, the disturbances began to subside. The errant lights on the water dimmed, the disembodied voices receded into a gentle background murmur, and the shifting objects around my cabin settled back into their proper places. Yet, even as the overt disturbances waned, I found that the lake continued to speak in its quiet, inscrutable language. There were still moments when, in the deep hours of the night, I would hear the soft patter of tiny feet along the shore, or catch a glimpse of a child's silhouette dancing among the trees. These were no longer accompanied by the intense feelings of dread that had once gripped me. Instead, I began to view them with a detached curiosity, a reminder that life, in all its forms, left traces that defied simple explanation. I resumed my daily routines with a renewed sense of calm, though I never entirely abandoned my habit of recording every unusual occurrence. I would sit by the lake with a cup of tea, watching as the morning mist gave way to a clear, reflective surface, and I'd feel a quiet kinship with the unseen presences that inhabited the landscape. There was a strange beauty in knowing that the past lingered here, that memories, both joyful and sorrowful, were etched into the very fabric of this place. I came to appreciate that the lake, with its reflective surface and timeless cadence, was not just a body of water, but a living repository of histories, a silent witness to events that had long since passed. As the months turned and the seasons shifted from the crisp chill of autumn to the barren stillness of winter, I began to embrace my new life with an unexpected sense of acceptance. The scientific part of my mind, honed by years of precision and logic, continued to analyze the phenomena, yet I also learned to appreciate the mystery that lay beyond measurable data. I kept a detailed log of temperatures, wind patterns, and the exact times when voices or laughter were recorded, but I also filled pages with reflections, poems and meditations that spoke of loss, beauty, and the poignant interplay between life and memory. There were evenings when I would walk along the shoreline, the snow crunching softly beneath my boots, and I would pause to gaze out over the dark, glassy expanse of the lake. In those moments, I sometimes felt as if I were not entirely alone, that, somewhere in the depths of the water, the echoes of the past were gently calling out to me. I did not feel fear, exactly, but a profound sadness and tenderness, as if the lake were mourning a tragedy that had never been allowed to fade. I began to understand that these haunting experiences were not something to be eradicated or explained away, but rather a part of the land's natural tapestry, a subtle, spectral reminder that life and death, joy and sorrow, were intertwined in ways that defied simple logic. In time, I reached a quiet resolution. I chose to remain at Echo Lake, accepting the eerie coexistence of the living and the spectral as a permanent aspect of my new life. I realized that I had not come here merely to escape the cacophony of modern life, but to engage in a deeper conversation with the natural world, a dialogue that required both the precision of reason and the openness of the heart. I had learned to listen to the wind and the water, to interpret the shifting patterns of light on the lake, and to recognize that even in solitude, one was never truly alone. Now, as I sit by the window of my cabin, watching the soft light of dawn spill over the still waters of Echo Lake, I feel a gentle acceptance that permeates every part of my being. The spectral laughter of children, once a source of inexplicable fear, has become a bittersweet melody in the background of my days, a reminder of the fragility of life and the enduring power of memory. I continue to document what I experience, not in the hope of proving a point to anyone else, but simply to honor the subtle, ineffable truths of this place. My journals have become a blend of technical observations and poetic musings, a record of a life lived at the edge of two worlds. I have come to see that the disturbances, the strange lights, and the shifting objects are not anomalies to be eradicated, but signs that the past lingers on in quiet, mysterious ways. Echo Lake, with its calm surface and hidden depths, has taught me that not everything can, or should, be measured and explained. Sometimes the beauty of life lies in its mysteries, in the silent interplay between what can be known and what must remain elusive. In accepting this balance, I have found a peace that transcends the limitations of logic and embraces the full spectrum of human experience. There are nights when I still feel a chill as I wander the path along the water's edge, the moon casting long, reflective shadows that seem to reach out with gentle, ghostly fingers. In those moments, I recall the soft voices that once startled me in the fog, the flickering lights on the water that danced with a life of their own, and the spectral figures of children who played in the half-light of early dawn. And rather than feeling fear, I feel a deep, abiding respect for the forces that have shaped this place. I realize that I have become a custodian of a secret history, a guardian of a fragile peace between the past and the present. As winter slowly gives way to the tentative stirrings of spring, I prepare for another cycle of change. The ice on the lake will eventually melt, revealing the dark, fertile water beneath, and the forest will awaken with the promise of new life. I have learned to embrace this perpetual rhythm, understanding that every season brings its own set of wonders and mysteries. My days now pass in a measured cadence, punctuated by moments of quiet reflection and unexpected marvels. A bird's call at dawn, a glimmer of sunlight breaking through lingering fog, the gentle ripple of water stirred by a breeze. Looking back on the long journey that brought me here, I am struck by how much I have changed. Once, I had been a man defined by precision, logic, and a relentless need for control. Now, I find that my greatest insights come not from the certainty of numbers and equations, but from the soft murmur of the wind and the whispered memories of Echo Lake. I have learned that living off-grid is not merely a retreat from the modern world. It is an ongoing conversation with the forces that shape our reality, both seen and unseen. In the quiet solitude of these northern woods, I have discovered that there is beauty in uncertainty, comfort in the inexplicable, and a kind of hope that emerges from accepting the world in all its contradictions. The haunting presence of the children, the strange lights on the water, and the shifting, inexplicable objects have become part of my daily tapestry, a gentle reminder that even in a world governed by logic and reason, there is room for mystery, wonder, and the delicate poetry of the unknown. So I continue to live here at Echo Lake, not as an isolated exile from the world, but as someone who has embraced the full, complex reality of existence, a reality where the echoes of the past blend with the vibrant pulse of the present, and where every day is an invitation to listen more deeply, to observe more keenly, and to accept that some mysteries are meant to remain as eternal whispers on the wind. And as I write these words by the soft glow of my desk lamp, with the lake's reflective surface visible through the frosted window, I know that I have found a kind of home that no modern convenience or technological marvel could ever offer. Here, in the interplay of light and shadow, science and myth, I have discovered a truth that defies the confines of any single explanation, a truth that is as vast and mysterious as the quiet, unending waters of Echo Lake. I never imagined that a single decision, a resignation letter typed in sterile office air, could lead me to a place where the very ground seemed to murmur ancient secrets. Yet, here I am, standing in the heart of a secluded hollow in the bluegrass region near Lexington, Kentucky, where the rolling pastures and weathered old trees hide mysteries as old as the hills themselves. My name is Samantha Ford, though everyone calls me Sam, and I traded a relentless corporate life for the promise of self-reliance and solitude in a battered, centuries-old farmhouse that sat on a patch of cursed land. Or so the locals whispered. It wasn't a leap into the unknown as much as it was a calculated retreat from the suffocating demands of boardrooms and endless deadlines. I craved independence, a place where I could build a life on my own terms, far removed from the neon glare and endless chatter of modern existence. When I first saw the farmhouse, its faded white paint barely clinging to weathered wood, its sagging porch creaking under the weight of forgotten summers, I felt an inexplicable pull. The property was set in a gently undulating landscape, dotted with stands of ancient oak and hickory, and framed by fields where horses once roamed freely. Yet, as I crossed the threshold, a chill slid along my spine, as though the house itself was silently greeting me with both a welcome and a warning. In the first few weeks, I busied myself with repairs and the simple routines of off-grid living, mending fences, chopping firewood, and cultivating a modest garden. The days began with the soft, golden light of dawn spilling over dew-drenched fields, and the nights, although cloaked in darkness, were at first punctuated by the familiar sounds of nature. Crickets chirping, the distant rustle of leaves in the wind, and the soft murmur of a nearby creek. I took solace in the routine and the promise of a simpler, more authentic existence. But it wasn't long before the familiar became unsettling. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. One warm evening, as I was securing the screen on the back door, I caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye. A flicker of laughter that was neither joyful nor entirely human. I froze, heart pounding, convinced that I must have imagined it. Later that night, as I sat alone in the dim light of my living room reading by a single kerosene lamp, I noticed that strange symbols had appeared on the frame of the front door. At first, I assumed I must have been sleep-deprived, that perhaps my hand had brushed against something I couldn't remember, leaving behind these cryptic carvings. But there they were, intricate loops and curves that pulsed faintly in the moonlight, as though imbued with a hidden energy. They were not random scrawls. They carried a deliberate, almost ritualistic quality that unsettled me deeply. I tried to convince myself that it was all a matter of nerves, a byproduct of the isolation and the stress of starting over in a place so different from everything I'd ever known. Yet, as the nights grew longer and the wind began to whistle through the hollow in ways that sounded eerily like disembodied laughter, I could no longer ignore the creeping sense of being watched. On more than one occasion, I awoke from sleep to find the distinct scent of burning wood permeating the air. Though no fire had been lit in or near the house, the odor was sharp and acrid, like a warning from some unseen presence. It was as if the earth itself was exhaling smoke from beneath, an omen that something dark and ancient lay buried in the soil. My first true confrontation with these disturbances came on a night when the air was thick with humidity, and the sky a patchwork of dark clouds. I had been reading on the porch when I heard it, a series of soft, playful giggles carried on the wind, intermingled with a distant, childlike chatter that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. I rose slowly, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling, and walked toward the sound. The giggles led me to a small clearing behind the house, where the tall grasses swayed in a restless dance. There, beneath a gnarled oak whose twisted branches clawed at the heavens, I felt a presence, an inexplicable mix of mirth and malice that sent shivers through me. I couldn't see anyone. Instead, I felt as if the voices were emanating from the very earth. I stood in silence for what felt like an eternity, trying to decipher the meaning of the sound, but the laughter faded into the rustle of the wind before I could gather my thoughts. The next day, determined to make sense of these inexplicable events, I visited the small town nearby. I found myself in a cramped general store, where the shelves were lined with local produce and faded photographs of a bygone era. I struck up a conversation with an old man named Hank, whose weathered face and slow, deliberate manner suggested that he carried the history of these lands in his bones. Over a shared cup of strong black coffee, I mentioned the strange carvings and the disembodied laughter, my voice wavering between curiosity and apprehension. Hank's eyes narrowed for a moment, and he leaned in close, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The holler you've chosen isn't just any patch of land, miss. Folks around here say it's cursed by an old devilish force, a spirit that's been restless ever since some long-forgotten tragedy. They call it the Devil's Hollow, and it's been known to mark a home with strange signs and eerie sounds." His words struck me like a cold gust of wind. I had expected local lore, but the seriousness in Hank's tone lent his tale an authenticity that I couldn't dismiss lightly. That evening, I returned home with a mind buzzing with questions and a heart heavy with uncertainty. I spent hours poring over old county records at the local library, seeking any mention of curses, haunted hollows, or devilish forces. I discovered fragmented accounts of unexplained deaths, sudden disappearances, and unexplained phenomena that had occurred in the very vicinity of my farmhouse decades ago. There were whispered stories of a witch's curse and a devil's mark left on the land by a bitter feud, but the details were murky and varied from one teller to the next. I began to piece together a patchwork history of my new home, a history steeped in sorrow, anger, and a palpable sense of foreboding. The more I learned, the more I realized that my presence here might have stirred up something that was better left undisturbed. I found myself at a crossroads between the rational, modern mind I had always trusted and the ancient wisdom that now seemed to hover on the edges of my reality. Determined not to be driven out by forces I neither fully understood nor completely believed in, I resolved to take action. I began by reinforcing the physical defenses of my property. installing better locks, setting up motion-sensitive lights, and clearing away any brush or debris that might provide hiding places for unwelcome visitors. But, as I fortified my home against the tangible, I also sought to fortify my spirit against the intangible. I reached out to a local folklorist named Richard, a soft-spoken man with a keen interest in the legends and myths of the bluegrass region. Richard invited me to his modest home, where shelves of dusty tomes and yellowed maps filled every available space. Over cups of mint julep and slow, thoughtful conversation, he explained that many of the stories in the area spoke of a malevolent force that was not so much a ghost as it was a living curse, a presence that fed on the anger and sorrow of past transgressions. "This land has seen its share of betrayal and bloodshed," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "Some believe that the devil himself, or one of his minions, left an imprint here. When you see those markings, hear that laughter, or smell that burning wood, it's not just mischief. It's a reminder of that old sin, still haunting these hills." His words, layered with both reverence and regret, resonated with me deeply. I realized that in order to claim this place as my own, I would have to come to terms with its troubled past and, perhaps, perform my own rites of protection. That night, under a moon that shone with an otherworldly brilliance, I decided to conduct a midnight vigil of my own. I had spent the day preparing a small altar on the back porch, a humble assembly of items that represented both modern practicality and ancient tradition. I placed a sturdy brass lantern in the center, its warm glow a symbol of hope against the encroaching darkness, and arranged a circle of candles around it. I had also gathered a few objects from the local store, a bundle of sage tied with twine, a small iron horseshoe that Hank had told me was considered a lucky charm in these parts, and a faded scrap of paper printed with an old protective prayer that Richard had shared with me. I sat in silence, the only sound the soft crackle of the candles and the distant rustling of the trees, and I began to speak the words of the prayer in a steady, deliberate tone. I recited them not as an act of supplication, but as a declaration of my intent to honor the past and assert my right to live peacefully on this land. For a long time, nothing happened. The night remained still, as if holding its breath, and the only evidence of the ritual was the flickering of the candle flames in the gentle breeze. Then, as I reached the final lines of the prayer, I felt a sudden shift, a tangible, almost electric change in the atmosphere. The air grew cooler, and the previously subtle scent of burning wood intensified, as though the very ground beneath me had exhaled a deep, ancient exclamation. In the periphery of my vision, I thought I saw movement, a shadow slithering just beyond the reach of the lantern's glow. I held my breath, heart pounding, and stared into the dark, trying to discern the shape of the intruder. For a fleeting moment, I could almost make out the outline of a figure, a woman, perhaps, dressed in garments that blurred the line between modern practicality and timeless ritual. Her eyes, if they could be called that, seemed to hold a sorrow that transcended centuries, and her presence exuded both a fierce warning and a tender plea for understanding. I cannot say whether that figure was real or a trick of the light and my own anxious mind, but in that moment I knew that I had made my stand. I spoke softly, my voice resonating with a newfound strength born of desperation and hope. "I honor you, and I ask for peace on this land. I will not be driven away by fear, nor will I forget the lessons of the past." As the words left my lips, the shadow receded, dissolving into the inky darkness like a wisp of smoke on a cold wind. I sat there for what felt like hours, letting the silence wash over me, until finally the night returned to its natural rhythm, a rhythm of crickets, rustling leaves, and the distant, steady beat of an unseen heart. In the days and weeks that followed, I began to adapt to a new reality, one where the uncanny presence was not an enemy to be vanquished, but an integral part of the land's character. I continued my routines with renewed determination, tending to the garden, mending fences, and even venturing out into the surrounding fields to inspect the old trees for fresh markings. I took careful notes in my journal, recording not only the physical changes but the emotions that each disturbance evoked. There were moments of inexplicable sadness when the scent of burning wood wafted through an open window, and times of quiet wonder when I caught a glimpse of a spectral figure beneath the moonlight. Each experience, whether terrifying or strangely comforting, wove itself into the tapestry of my new life. I also made a habit of meeting with Richard and Hank periodically, sharing with them the minutiae of my encounters and listening intently as they recounted further fragments of local lore. In our conversations, the lines between myth and reality blurred, and I began to appreciate that the stories of curses and devilish forces were not mere superstitions but living narratives that had shaped the very identity of this land. I learned that many of the residents here carried a quiet acceptance of the strange and the inexplicable, a tacit understanding that some mysteries were woven into the fabric of the world, impervious to the tidy logic of modern science. This realization was both humbling and liberating. I found solace in the idea that I, too, was part of that ancient continuum, a transient but significant thread in the long history of the bluegrass. Gradually, I established a series of protective measures that blended the old with the new. I installed subtle lighting around the perimeter of my property, not as a deterrent to the darkness, but as a gentle reminder of the boundary between the known and the unknown. I continued to refresh the offerings at my makeshift altar, each time adding a personal note, a prayer, a promise, a silent acknowledgement of the past. I even began to host small gatherings with a few like-minded neighbors, evenings when we would sit around a fire, share stories of local lore, and honor the land with music and quiet rituals. These gatherings were not grand ceremonies, but rather humble acknowledgments of a reality that embraced both beauty and darkness. There were still nights when an eerie, playful sound would echo through the hollow, a sound that might be mistaken for the laughter of unseen children, or perhaps the mocking cackle of a mischievous spirit. And there were times when the very earth seemed to tremble with an ancient anger, a reminder of sins long buried beneath layers of time. But over time, those moments began to lose their edge of terror, transforming instead into solemn reminders that I had chosen this life with all its imperfections and mysteries. I now look back on those early days with a mixture of awe and acceptance. I have come to understand that the haunted echoes and the cryptic carvings are not merely signs of a cursed past, but expressions of a living history, a history that demands to be remembered, that calls out to those willing to listen with open hearts. I have learned that fear can be tempered by respect, that isolation need not be synonymous with loneliness, and that sometimes the only way to overcome the darkness is to acknowledge its presence and coexist with it. Today, as I stand on the creaking porch of my farmhouse on a crisp Kentucky morning, I feel a profound sense of balance. The land around me, with its rolling pastures and ancient trees, still carries the weight of its mysterious past. I can still detect the faint aroma of burning wood in the early hours, hear the soft, distant laughter that seems to emanate from the hollows, and see the occasional flash of cryptic symbols carved into an old fence post by the light of the full moon. But these signs no longer fill me with dread. Rather, they remind me of the intricate dance between light and shadow that defines this place, and, by extension, defines life itself. I have chosen to remain here, in this haunted hollow, not because I am impervious to fear, but because I have learned that embracing the mysteries of the world is far more empowering than hiding from them. I have learned to honor both the beauty and the darkness, to protect my sanctuary, while also allowing the ancient spirit of the land to speak its truths. Each day, as I tend to my garden, repair a creaking board on the porch, or simply sit in quiet reflection while the sun dips below the horizon, I feel a connection to something larger than myself, a deep, resonant rhythm that echoes through the ages. I sometimes find myself writing long into the night, my pen capturing not only observations and practical notes, but also the emotions stirred by the unseen forces that linger at the edges of my reality. These writings, interspersed with sketches and hurried notations, have become a record of my journey, a testament to the fact that even in a modern world defined by rationality and control, there is still room for mystery, for magic, and for the kind of raw, unfiltered experience that can only be found when one is willing to step beyond the boundaries of the everyday. And so, as I sit here in the soft glow of dawn, listening to the gentle chorus of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle in the fields, I know that I have found my place. My farmhouse in the bluegrass, marked by its ghostly signs and ancient warnings, is not a prison or a burden. It is a home, a living, breathing space where every creak of the floor, every whisper of the wind, every inexplicable scent of burning wood is a reminder of the delicate balance between the past and the present, between fear and hope. I have learned that sometimes the greatest acts of resilience come not from resisting the darkness, but from learning to dance with it, to honor it, and ultimately to let it remind us of our own fragile, precious humanity. This is my story, a tale of transformation, of finding beauty in the inexplicable, and of making peace with the forces that defy simple explanation. I remain here, steadfast in my resolve, with a heart both wary and full of wonder, determined to live fully in a world where the old and the new coexist in a tapestry of light and shadow. And every night, as I light a candle by my door and trace the cryptic markings with my fingertips, I silently thank the land for its harsh lessons and its gentle reminders, for teaching me that true strength lies not in denying the unknown, but in embracing it with an open heart. In this sacred, haunted hollow of the bluegrass, I have discovered a truth that transcends fear and defies explanation, a truth that whispers to those who are willing to listen, that every scar, every echo, and every ghostly laugh is a testament to the enduring power of memory, a quiet call to honor the past while stepping boldly into the future. And as I take another step onto the weathered porch, I know that I have not only built a home here, but I have also found a way to live in harmony with the ancient, restless spirit of this land, a spirit that, despite its dark warnings, has given me the strength to be truly free.